Alrighty, chat, let's get started. We tried to fix our audio. Hopefully it worked. We all can thank the tech teller, the one, the only, the absolutely beautiful tech teller. Okay, so today, chat, welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Dr. Alok Kanoja. Even though I am a doctor, I strongly encourage y'all to remember that everything we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as educational or educational entertainment. That's what we're doing here. We're not treating any psychiatric illnesses. We're not practicing medicine here. We're just talking about mental health. So just a reminder that everything we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as education or is for entertainment purposes. If y'all have a medical concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. And yeah, so that is not this. Just a quick reminder, okay? I feel like that was a fragmented disclaimer, so we're going to do it again. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a doctor, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational or entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a medical concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. Isn't it better when we just do it the regular way, chat? Yeah, so that's going to be especially true today because today we're going to be talking about dissociation and depersonalization. So we're going to do kind of a deep dive. I'm actually super excited about today. This has felt like something that is very difficult to do, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But I feel like really good about it. I've been working on it for a little while. It's such a complicated topic. And the reason it's a complicated topic is because we don't have, on the one hand, we have a lot of science on it, but the science is super fragmented. It involves a lot of different regions of the brain, and we don't quite know what's going on. And on the other hand, we don't know much about it, right? So it's like, it's one of these phenomenon that we haven't been able to reduce to like just one thing. So sometimes in psychiatry, we can like sort of figure out what's wrong. Okay, you've got OCD. Like we understand what is going on in OCD. It is a pattern of obsessions, which are intrusive thoughts, and then compulsions, which are behaviors that address the anxiety of those thoughts. But with dissociation, it is a loss of the sense of self. or depersonalization. So we feel disconnected. So what does that mean, right? So getting into that is something that we're going to do today. The other really interesting thing about dissociation is that we haven't gone too much into it, because from an epidemiologic perspective, dissociation and depersonalization are rare, right? So like if we look at something like a mood disorder, like depression, it affects like maybe 30% of people. So we talk a lot about depression. We have a whole guide to depression. We talk about lack of motivation. We talk about how to find happiness, because that affects a lot of people. So one of the reasons that we talk a little bit less about dissociation, which we have a whole guide to trauma now that goes into it, is because I thought that it affected very few people. And we used to think it affected very few people, but as we'll learn today, it affects a ton of people. And we'll kind of go into like why that is. And specifically, like I'm going to just do a quick spoiler alert as to later in the stream. Hold on. Okay. Attachment disorganization and dissociation in virtual worlds, a study on problematic internet use among players of online role-playing games. What? 13.5% scored above the IAT cutoff. There was a high prevalence of attachment disorganization, 47%. So it turns out that technology is actually really playing into our dissociative abilities. And we're going to dig into that. And I think a lot of the problems that we see today are like a lot of the problems that like we see online. I just connected these dots like literally in the last 24 hours. So like I'm not motivated. I don't know what to do with my life. I don't feel like doing anything. I feel socially anxious. I have intrusive ruminating thoughts. I daydream a lot. This is all potentially related to dissociation. So from becoming a fringe topic, which is intellectually and academically interesting, I think we have now stumbled on possibly what is one of the biggest emerging growing problems in our world, which is that we're all dissociating a little bit more. Okay, so now I feel hyped about it. It's going to be challenging because there's just a lot to cover. Let me get through some of this. Okay, so before we get into that, a couple of quick announcements. So first of all, I wanted to give a huge thank you and express a lot of gratitude for people who have signed up with memberships. So I don't know if y'all remember this, but we launched memberships a few months ago, and the purpose of memberships is to do a couple of things. One is to do more content. The second is to do more in-depth content. So what we do on the membership side is deeper lectures, kind of like what we're doing today. And then the other cool thing is that members get to choose, so we can like build, we can level up. So we can do like part 1, part 2, part 3. So we did like an emotions 101 lecture that a lot of people really loved. We did a lot of stuff on like Avasana and Glishta, some of these like yogic concepts that are more advanced. So we can get to more advanced stuff, because everything that we do in general is like, we find that the more advanced we go, the more people we leave behind, because a lot of new people are joining. We've grown a lot over the last year. This is great. This is all good news. But then we're faced with this tension between, for a lot of new people, how do we make things accessible to everyone versus how do we get to the advanced stuff? So huge thank you to everyone who signed up for memberships. The other cool thing is that we've used the funding from memberships to build additional things. And so thank you all very much for that. And I just wanted to show you all real quick. So a lot of people ask us for citations. So we build videos in a slightly different way. We don't just have citations for every video. We have like topics. So what we've done is like, so practically what I do, just to show you all an example of today. So for today, you know, the papers that I'm going to be leaning into are going to be like some of these. So I'll show you all this. And then, so we've got, you know, this paper, we have this paper. So dissociation, alterations in brain function and structure, implications for BPD, dissociation in neuroscience, history and perspectives, neurobiology of dissociation, unity and disunity in the mind, body, brain. So these are like our 4 major, papers that we're going to be examining today. But just because we have 4 papers that we're examining today, there's actually like 30 or 40 additional, 100 actually technically papers that are going into today's lecture that are not the core citations for today, but they're like all the other stuff that we read. So what we've done is put together a general works cited page that will grow over time and we'll add to it. So if you guys, and so this is not like the bibliography for a particular lecture. What we've done is when we were sort of thinking about the works cited page, it's not like the bibliography for a lecture, because I don't know if y'all have seen like, you know, bibliographies for like academic papers, but this is not accessible. Like this is like, what is like, where is the actual, like this is like, there's 6 pages of this shit, right? So it just gets overwhelming. So since we're not, the purpose of this is not academia, right? The purpose of this is like educational. So what we've tried to do is select the papers that are the most relevant, have the best sources of information. We've dug through a lot, and that's where our works cited page is. So that's up, and we'll continue to add to it. And oftentimes when people are asking for citations, like, this community is so awesome, it's because you guys want to read stuff. So instead of like, you know, documenting each statement that we make, because that's not the goal of this. I mean, when we, you know, submit a manuscript for publication, that's what we do there, because that's what you need to do there. But for here, these are kind of high value papers that if y'all want to read more, we consider to be like really, really, really good. Okay. So thank y'all so much. A couple of other things. So our trauma guide is now released. So we're super happy about this. It's something that we've been working on for about 2 years. It's finally up. So we're going to be, a lot of the resources in the trauma guide will relate to things that we're talking about today. But as always, we try to make, you know, our lectures on stream and stuff to be like self-sufficient. So you don't need to get the trauma guide or anything like that. I would say that, you know, this is going to be like a start to finish thing that includes what is dissociation, how do we understand it, and what you can do about it. And then if y'all are interested in additional resources or more of a framework or a deeper dive into a particular topic that we're talking about today, definitely check out the trauma guide. Built with a lot of love. And then I think we're going to have one of our devs actually join us in maybe about an hour and a half and talk a little bit about like what we built, because I think it's pretty cool. Yeah. So sound good, chat? We good? Okay. So can we get started? We okay? Talk? Teach things? Enough blah blah? Okay. Now I need to get mentally prepared. This is going to go here. This is going to go here. I'm going to set up my battle station chat. Battle station time. Okay. No. Yeah. Okay. Main screen turn on. All right. Now we begin the lecture on dissociation. Okay. So today we're going to talk about dissociation, depersonalization, some degree of clinical stuff, okay? So a lot of people in our community will ask us about dissociation and depersonalization. And these concepts have been generally considered to be a part of psychiatry and specifically trauma-related disorders. So there doesn't seem to be a dedicated video to dissociation and derealization. There's one video on the Clips channel from a Miscus interview. I've been getting treated for ADHD. It's 24/7 of feeling like I'm living in a memory or dream, but maybe not that. It's hard to describe. So we haven't done a dedicated video on it. This post, by the way, was 1 year ago. So just a quick reminder that, you know, when y'all post stuff, like, we pay attention. The problem is that, like, building this video, you know, took 10, 12, 14, arguably 100 hours, really about 8, let's say, plus a lot of back research, you know, that kind of went into it. So today we're going to be talking about dissociation, derealization. And like I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons that we have steered away from this topic so we've steered away from this topic for a couple of reasons. The first is that these disorders, so dissociative identity disorder, derealization disorder, even PTSD subtype, dissociative subtype, borderline personality disorder, we've talked about a lot of these things by themselves. So we talk a lot about complex trauma, we have a guide to trauma. But the specific aspect of dissociation I thought was exceedingly rare. So if you look at things like dissociative identity disorder, it is probably 1 out of 10,000 or 1 out of 1,000 people have it, somewhere in that ballpark. So I had one teacher at the Massachusetts General Hospital and the Harvard Medical School who was an absolute Chad. And I asked them one day, what do you think about this whole multiple personality business? And he said that I think about multiple personalities the way that I think about aliens. And I was like, what does that mean? And he said, well, I'm sure that technically it exists, but I don't believe anyone who says they've seen it, right? So this is kind of like where I trained, this was sort of the attitude towards dissociative identity disorder. That was at MGH. McLean is a different story. So, this is something that gets like glorified in the media a lot, where you have this like split personality person who's like an evil killer on one moment, and then they snap, and then their facial expression changes and their tone changes, and now they're talking like this, like, hey man, like, I know you think I'm Dr. K, but really I'm a surfer bruh. Right? Like this is what our portrayals in the media are. So this is something that is, generally speaking, in psychiatry exceedingly rare. That being said, what we're seeing is that it is becoming more common. So what we're seeing is that, dissociation related to trauma is more common. BPD is a little bit more common. So as I kind of dug into this, I started to realize, like, okay, this is not quite as rare. The second thing is that understanding of dissociation and depersonalization is very difficult. And the reason is because it isn't focal. So if we look at depersonalization and dissociation, what are they? So we'll give you kind of a quick example of this, okay? So this is from a paper, Dissociation and Alterations in Brain Function and Structure, Implications for Borderline Personality Disorder. Absolutely great paper. One of the main papers that we're going to be referencing today. So dissociation is a complex heterogeneous phenomenon. This means that it is hard to study and hard to define, right? So it's complex. It's not just one thing. Heterogeneous means that there's lots of different variants of it. It has been defined as a disruption of and/or discontinuity in the normal subjective integration of one or more aspects of psychological functioning, including but not limited to memory, identity, consciousness, perception, and motor control. Okay? So this is part of what makes studying dissociation and depersonalization and talking about it difficult. Because it is not, first of all, it's complex, so it is not one thing. So when we look at something like, I don't know, let's say like, what's a good example? Like, let's say a phobia. So if I have a phobia of snakes, it is focal, right? It is like one particular thing. It's not like a lot of different varieties of it. It involves like one general circuit of the brain that becomes hyperactive. If we look at something like mood disorder, it's kind of like, okay, if you've got a major depressive disorder, like you're depressed, right? There are a couple of different variants, but it tends to be focal, tends to be pretty common, so we can kind of study it. You have negative self-attitude, you have difficulty with sleeping, you've got some neurovegetative symptoms, and it's like relatively speaking simpler. I'm sure that depression experts, and even I, can make an argument against that, okay? But if we look at like dissociation and depersonalization, the reason that it's hard to study is because you have a sense of self. Your sense of self interacts with the outside world. When there is a problem in this relationship between self and the outside world, or self and self, this is what results in dissociation or depersonalization. And then the question becomes, what is the self? Well, then that becomes really complicated, because the self is not one thing. It is an integration of perceptions, beliefs, interoceptive experiences, right? It's all of this stuff that we kind of saw over here, including but not limited to memory, identity, consciousness, perception, and motor control. And then what happens is we're like, okay, so like, where does the self exist in the brain? This is where the self exists in the brain. This is why dissociation is hard to understand. because it involves prefrontal cortical structures, your anterior cingulate, inferior frontal gyrus, fusiform gyrus, insula, amygdala, posterior cingulate, and the precuneus, superior temporal gyrus, social cognition, memory, hippocampus, and thalamus. And then there's all these connections, but these are just all the parts that involved. And then what happens is you have connections between these parts. And so what happened, the reason that dissociation and depersonalization is hard to scientifically understand, right? And even this, like even in this fucking paper, that this is complicated. And by the way, we're going to understand this, okay? We're going to understand this today. A schematic overview of brain regions and functions, among others. So even the authors of this paper that have put together this thing are like, this is not all of it, right? The precise neurobiological underpinnings of dissociation remain elusive. So this is why basically this crap is complicated. But that is okay, because we are going to figure it out today. So what we've done today is we're going to sit down, we're going to understand this from kind of the ground up. We're going to understand what dissociation is, what depersonalization is. We're going to tackle some of these neuroscience regions. We're going to talk some about clinical stuff. But the reason that I think that this lecture is the most important today is because dissociation is no longer something that 1 out of 1,000 to 1 out of 10,000 people deal with. It is now becoming exceedingly common. And a lot of the common problems that I see amongst the youngsters today, I think have some root in dissociation. So what we see is a lack of goal-directed behavior. What we see is a lack of motivation. What we see is I don't know who I am anymore, right? I'm confused. Is this a part of me, or is this some psychological trauma that I need to overcome? Who am I, and what are the parts of me that need to be healed? Am I lazy, or is this something I need to fix? So we don't know what we want anymore. We don't know how to get ourselves to direct towards something. We don't even know who we are anymore. And the question is, why is this becoming more common? What's going on? Well, it turns out attachment disorganization and dissociation in virtual worlds, a study on problematic internet use among players of online role-playing games. What the fuck, dude? So, there was a high prevalence of attachment disorganization, 47% among these players. They also reported significant dissociative experiences. Okay? And this is 13.5% of the people that they studied here. So from 1 out of 10,000, we're now going to 13 out of 100. Or greater than 1 out of 10. Now, this is just one particular study, and what we find here... did I lose this? GG. Hold on. So let's kind of jump straight to this. Give me a second, chat. All right, so look. So here's a great figure that kind of exemplifies what's going on here. So we have childhood experience of loss, neglect, and abuse, unresolved states of mind regarding attachment and dissociation, absorption to the internet to protect the self from traumatic memories and problematic internet use. So I want you all to think about this for a second. Okay, we're going to get into more detail. But what we're seeing right now is that when we have a fragmented sense of self, and this is the key thing in dissociation, what happens is that the internet serves as an enhancement of that fragmentation. So what is dissociation? Dissociation or depersonalization is we have this sense of self that is a combination of interoception, the way that I feel about myself, with memory, with feeling of emotions, with even things like analgesia, the feeling of pain or suppressing pain. We have all of these different sensations that we put together, and this is who I am. It is a combination of thoughts, memories, emotions, identity, physical sensations, sensory inputs. And then once this becomes fragmented, which is the basic issue in dissociation, now a part of myself can access the internet. And this is literally what the internet does. Right? And there's in this paper, like just to give you all an example of like how deep this goes. So let's take a quick look at this. And this is not the order that I wanted to do this in, but here we are. So hence, while it can be normal for a person to use the internet in order to temporarily shelter the self from unpleasant feelings, it is possible that some of the participants recruited for the second phase of the study have found a way to manage their disorganized states of mind through the misuse of virtual worlds and a total immersion in the alternative reality. Okay? This is crazy, dude. So, where is this thing about healer? I think this is here. Yeah. Okay. So another example is about a young woman who has been sexually abused in her adolescence. In the game, she is a magic healer who is able to restore health and give stronger powers to herself and her friends during the most difficult battles. Within a psychodynamic perspective, it is possible to connect her use of magical powers in the game to the desire of a magical repair for the wounded parts of herself. Like, fucking wild, right? So, hey, quick trivia question. What position do you guys think Dr. K tends to play when I'm on the internet? When I'm playing video games, I play a support position. I play healers. Surprising, huh? Is it shocking that I don't really gravitate toward FPSs? I gravitate towards co-op games and healers and things like that. So there are even studies that show that there are personality correlations between your personality type and what you play in a video game. Okay? So, and this is crazy. Like, we all know this, right? These papers are about us. So today's lecture is not for the 1 in 10, is also for the 1 in 10,000 people who has dissociation or depersonalization. But as we're going to see today, this is a huge part of this generation of people because the internet allows us to, the internet gives us such a powerful tool to enhance our dissociation or depersonalization. We can literally create a virtual identity. And then integrating this across into the real world is a problem. And we see this so deeply in our community. Why is it that I can grind in a video game and I can spend 10,000 hours trying to go for this shit, but I can't do something in my real life? This is a problem of dissociation or depersonalization. And that's why this lecture is important today. Okay? Enough of a preamble. So, let us begin. Okay? So the first thing is let's define what dissociation is. Okay, so dissociation and depersonalization. Okay, and the way that we're going to do this today is we're going to understand what dissociation and depersonalization is. We're going to understand it from a neuroscience perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about clinical perspectives, not too much. And then we're going to talk about gaming, the virtual world, and all this stuff. And then we're going to talk about what to do. Okay, so part 1, neuroscience. Part 2, clinical stuff. Part 3, gaming, virtual world. And part 4, what do. Okay? So, remember that when we're looking at dissociation and depersonalization, we have a sense of self. And the sense of self is an integration of memory, identity, consciousness. Okay, so what do we mean by consciousness? So consciousness is like your state of awareness. So when I'm unconscious, I'm completely unaware. When I'm in a normal waking state, I'm aware of my surroundings. But what we see in dissociation and depersonalization is that there are alterations in consciousness. So are you here right now? When you're depersonalized, you're like, there's something here, but I am not here, right? So we start to see all these weird variants in consciousness. And this is what's beautiful is like we've got memes, right? Are you okay? You didn't talk to me at school. Me at school. Like this is, you're inside you. You're not actually living your life. You're like inside observing your life. This is a disturbance of consciousness. Okay? Then we also have problems with perception. And we have changes in motor control. But this isn't it. Okay? What we also see with dissociation and depersonalization, I'm going to get rid of this now, okay, chat, because I need this space on the right. I need it. We also see analgesia. Okay, so analgesia is pain numbing. We also see alexithymia, or emotional numbness. Okay, so this is what happens in dissociation, is that we see all these different dimensions get affected. Now, the other big thing is that over here we have a disturbance of the self, but there's another feature of dissociation and depersonalization which is equally important, which is intrusions. So over here we're fractured. And then the other thing that tends to happen is we have this intrusions of overwhelming emotion. Right? So at times we feel numb, and at times we feel way too much. We have intrusive memories. We'll even have things like daydreaming, which I want to show you all real quick. Okay, it doesn't say it over here. But the posterior cingulate is involved in things like daydreaming, okay? So like this is where like I am trying to live my life. I'm trying to be me, but these weird daydreams keep on coming in and I start fantasizing about all this kind of stuff. So if you look at dissociation, this is very important to understand. It is not just an unplugging. It is also an intrusion. These things come hand in hand. Okay, and now let's understand why. Here's the basics of what happens when we dissociate. So here is the self. And if we look at the self, it is a combination of different things. So this is identity. So this is things like interoception. So my ability to detect what's in here. So when I ask you, how do you feel right now? You look inside yourself. Okay, then we also have sensory inputs. This is from things like the thalamus. Oh, Jesus. Okay. And then we have memories. And then we've got, I don't know, like emotions. Okay. So we have all these different parts of the self, right? We have perceptions. We kind of said that's over here, sensory input. We covered that. Then we have motor inputs. We have, pain. So here's what happens in dissociation. So this is a normal, healthy self. You are integrated. All of these things are coming together, right? And they make your experience of life. And in order to feel like yourself, you need all of these things together. So what happens in dissociation? What we see is a fracturing of this stuff. So now what happens is you become a piece, and one piece gets separated from the others. So what we do is we take this. I hope this will work. Can you do it? No! Fail. How do I make my eraser smaller? I don't know. Okay. GG. I will cut that. I will cut that. I will cut that. I will cut that. And then I will cut this. So maybe it'll work now. So now we're going to go here. And what I'm going to do, this is what happens in dissociation. My emotions get gone. And then my pain gets gone. So now I'm going to connect these two things. Now what I've done is I've taken myself, my experience of life, and I've divided it into two things. Okay? So now there's a part of me that has some memories, has some sense of identity, has some sensory input, has some motor input. This is great. I'm going along, I'm playing some video games, I'm going to my job. Everything's chilling, we vibing, we good. There's no pain, there's no negative emotion, there's kind of some numbness, right? So we kind of get to this picture. Where is it? This, right? This is what we are. For dissociators, pros feel nothing, cons feel nothing. So this is what ends up happening to me. And then what happens is this shit is still going on. It is just suppressed in the brain. And then what happens is this intrudes. So we see this intrusion. So this is important to understand, okay? If you look at studies of dissociation, what you'll find is that people who dissociate and say they don't feel anything will still have elevated physiologic responses. Their galvanic skin response is indicates stress. You'll see, you ask them, how do you feel? And they'll say, I feel numb. But their heart rate is like 120. Their blood pressure is elevating. They're diaphoretic. Their pupils are dilating. Their body is in a high stress state. This is also really interesting. So, you know, people who have avoidant attachment. So people who are avoidant attachment, have avoidant attachment, are scared of emotional connection to other people. And when they want someone to text them back and someone doesn't text them back, they say they're fine with it. They're like, I don't feel anything. But if you measure their physiology is stressed. So when you look at kids who have avoidant attachment, there's this famous study called The Strange Situation, where a kid is in a room with their mom or dad, I think usually mom. And then they're kind of like, they have this avoidant attachment, so they're not a big fan of mom. So they're just playing with some toys. Mom leaves, a stranger comes in. When a stranger comes in, and then mom comes in, and then the stranger leaves, the kid is acting very chill the whole time. They're acting chill. But inside, their physiology is going haywire. So what we see in dissociation is that everything that the situation is demanding can be going on. We just segregate ourselves into pieces. And this is why we see intrusive features to all of these diagnoses. So let's understand this, okay? This is really important to understand. So even though I feel numb right now, later on, I will feel in a very, very weird way, I'll feel this very powerful intrusion, or I'll feel triggered. So I get a disproportionate physiologic and emotional response to a benign stimulus. And the question is why? It's because our brain has segregated this stuff and walled it off, okay? So let's take a quick look at a paper that really explains this. Okay, wrong one. Okay. So the traumatic situation may be perceived as an unreal film scene that is not happening to oneself, but observed from a wider distance. Somatoform symptoms such as analgesia and out-of-body experiences may reduce awareness of physical injury, right? So this is what it starts to feel like. Okay. This is what we feel like, where we're not like actually living this life. We're separated from the life. Okay, so now this is important. The peritraumatic dissociation increases the subsequent risk of PTSD, although the precise mechanisms remain elusive. Disturbed information processing, mostly prominently memory alterations, may play an important role in this relationship. Leading to the fragmentation or compartmentalization of memory. Sensory, affective, and cognitive aspects of the traumatic event are encoded and stored as separate elements, which may later reoccur as implicit intrusive flashback memories accompanied by strong sensory impressions, as if the traumatic event was happening again in the present. Okay? So this is kind of what we're talking about, is if we look at this, what the mind does is it fragments, our brain fragments our sense of self and tucks some of it away for later. And then the reason that this is like a debilitating thing for most people is because then later what happens is this stuff that has been stored away then acts as an intrusive memory. So a minor trigger opens up this compartment of crap that has not been properly integrated, and then we feel overwhelmed. Okay? And this creates these really weird experiences. Right? So like we start to have stuff like this. Like you're in the middle of a conversation, babe, it's time for your static, right? It's time for here you are trying to participate in life, but then your brain is like, You're like, fuck. And now you're like, okay, like, how am I supposed to participate in a relationship? I'm on a date. I was having a good time, but now like this, and then I can't like do what I'm supposed to be doing right now. Okay? That's what happens. So this is like the neuroscientific mechanisms of this. We have an overwhelming experience, and so now we're going to talk about that. We fragment out, and the moment we fragment, we open the door to intrusion. We open the door to minor triggers, creating overwhelming emotional responses. We open the door to this, we open the door to overwhelming emotions. We open the door to flashbacks. We even open the door to daydreaming. So now let's understand, why the hell does this happen? So cool. Why does this happen? So if you look at studies of animal models, what we find is that this mechanism is a protective mechanism. So this is the way it kind of works. So we know that animals have this capacity to play dead. And remember that analgesia, or pain, the inability to feel pain, it is an important part of dissociation. So maybe I think I have this reference somewhere in there. I'll look through these tabs in a second. But basically what we know is that when we go through overwhelming pain, our body and our brain have a mechanism to protect us. And this goes way beyond humans. So an animal will play dead. And if we look at what happens in an animal that's playing dead, see, we normally think of inactivity as part of our parasympathetic nervous system. This is rest and digest. I'm sleeping, therefore I am chilling, right? I have to be very relaxed to go to sleep. But we can have a severe amount of inactivity, not as a form of extreme relaxation, but as a form of extreme stress. So if we look at an organism, there's the rest side, right? I'm chilling, I'm vibing, I'm relaxing, I'm resting. I feel relaxed, I can close my eyes, I can go to sleep, I'm inactive. Then we enter the stress realm. So it's fight or flight. And even beyond fight or flight is freeze. So an animal will play dead when it can no longer run and it can no longer fight, it freezes. It plays dead. And when it freezes, we see this compartmentalization in the brain. So the animal develops analgesia. It no longer feels physical pain, which is like when a predator, what they'll do is they'll like bite the animal. They're like, let me see if I can bite you and then see if you're still alive. Okay, and why animals play dead, we're not 100% sure, but there's some evidence that suggests that predators are wary, unless they're carrion eaters, predators are wary of dead animals because dead animals can make them sick. So that's why it's got kind of weird, right? Why won't a predator just eat something that's dead? It's because there's some evolutionary advantage, and that's why these animals have learned to play dead. Because things that are rotting and are full of bacteria will make animals sick, and therefore animals will stay away from things that they think are already dead. I'm happy to kill you, but I don't want you if you're already dead. That's the way a predator thinks. So in this freeze response, what we literally have to do, this is not at the level of like conscious suppression. This is important to understand because like mice will do this. This is at a neurological level where the animal, the intense level of fear induces a dissociative state, induces analgesia to pain, induces, and if you kind of think about this, we don't really know this, right? Because we haven't studied the consciousness of mice. But I imagine you can look at an animal that's playing dead and they're like in some weird zone where they're not like really present. And the same thing happens with human beings. So when we enter a extremely stressful state, and what we also know is that dissociation and depersonalization are oftentimes associated with severe trauma. So basically what the brain does, our brain has this protective mechanism where if the pain is too much, we're going to unplug from our internal experience of this. And so Bessel van der Kolk did a lot of cool work on this where he sort of like noticed that the activity across the corpus callosum, the brain stops talking to itself. Because normally the brain is all connected with itself. It's like, we're going to talk over here, we're going to talk over there, we're going to talk over there, we're going to talk over there. And what we tend to find in dissociation is that the way that the brain talks to itself changes. And it's not just that it entirely talks to itself less. There are some parts that'll talk to each other more. So the parts of our brain that will numb out, send numbing signals to other parts of the brain, those will become hyperactive. We'll show those in a minute. Okay? So dissociation is basically a compensation for when things are overwhelming, we're just going to unplug. That's what dissociation is. The problem is at the moment that we unplug, we compartmentalize, and then that activity spills over later. The other problem that we tend to see is that once we start fragmenting our sense of self, our ability to move in the world becomes problematic. Because the way that we move in the world involves an integrated sense of self, right? So like if we look at like the way that our world is designed, the human brain didn't evolve all these pieces to not use 30% of it when we're trying to succeed. Success in the world requires like all parts of your brain. And we made some levels of, compensation when someone is missing a part of their body. If someone is blind, the human society has built compensations to balance that handicap. If someone is missing their legs, we've built compensations. The problem is that from a neurologic perspective, we haven't built these compensations in our world yet. Maybe, accommodations for things like ADHD is the closest that we get. But our society presumes that you have an integrated brain. So let's talk about a couple of examples of this. So if I want to live a normal, happy life, what do I need? I need all parts of my brain. I need to be able to detect what's going on around me. I need access to my memories, right? I need to be able to form new memories. In order to be successful in my job, I need to have motivation. And motivation comes from an integration of identity and emotion and some amount of frontal lobe stuff. Now, if I'm numbing myself out, like this is what we see, right? So going back to this meme. So this is the problem. Pros, feel nothing. Cons, feel nothing. And when you feel nothing, you can't motivate yourself. Because if we look at what are our most powerful motivators are not logic. Our most powerful motivators are emotion. And so Judith Herman noticed this in her original paper on PTSD, that people with a history of trauma have something called a paralysis of initiation. They are not self-starters. And why are they not self-starters? Because they have lived in a world where self-starting doesn't work. They've lived in a world where their goal is not accomplishment, their goal is survival. And when your goal is survival, you build an organism that is reactive, right? So like I want y'all to think about, let's say you're playing a football or soccer match. People with a history of PTSD and complex PTSD, there's like your forward, right? Their job is to go and win points. And then there's the goalie. The goalie's job is to protect against what comes in. And the problem in trauma is that some people are just goalies. So if some attack happens to me, I'm going to defend myself. But I don't know how to score points. The goalie's job is just to sit in this pen. I'm not going to go out into the world. I'm not going to accomplish anything. I'm just going to sit here and wait for shit to happen. And all of my training has been designed to help me wait for shit, to prepare for when shit happens. And these people have something called a paralysis of initiation. They cannot go out and score points in life. So this creates the experience of just existing. And it feels like you're just waiting for the next bad thing to happen, and your day-to-day is like, can I survive the next storm? Can I survive the next storm? Can I survive the next storm? And we look at this and we think, oh my God, like then you look at other people, right? And you think like, I'm lazy. You're not lazy. The way that your organism has been rewired is to play defense. Because somewhere early on, you learned that trying to play offense is a waste of time. Mommy, Daddy, can I have this doll for Christmas? No, fuck you. You've been a bad kid. You don't get anything. How dare you ask when you've been doing this and you've been doing this and you've been doing this? How dare you have desires? And the most sad versions of this that I've seen is when kids are good. I've seen this. It's so traumatic when there's like, someone who's like a star athlete whose parent used to be a star athlete, but then they got pregnant. And then they had you. And then their dreams of going to the Olympics disappeared when you were born. And then they blame you for it. And so they want you to go to the Olympics. They want you to be the best, but the better and better and better you become, the more pissed at you your parent gets. So much toxicity in the highest levels of athletic performance. So we create these kinds of situations where we don't know how to act because we are fragmented from ourself. We're constantly playing defense. And as part of playing that defense, we compartmentalize, but all that crap is still there, and then it explodes into our consciousness when we don't want it. It gets triggered. And then even if we're trying to live life, we get overwhelmed. So over here, we don't have enough emotion. We don't have enough motivation. We don't have even memories. And then over here, we get too many memories, too many inappropriate memories, too much inappropriate emotion. So this is the fundamental of dissociation. Let's go into more detail. Okay? All right. So individuals who learn to dissociate in response to traumatic, stressful situations may be more likely to do so in the presence of even relatively minor stressors. So we already talked about this, right? So this is like where what happens is we have this pile of stuff that is sitting here, and then this will intrude based on a tiny trigger. So here I am living my relatively numb, ordinary, blasé life. And then I'm going to have a tiny trigger that triggers all of this intrusive thinking. Okay? Maybe I misspelled blasé. So now let's talk about brain. This is cool. Okay? So increased recruitment of the PFC may both directly and indirectly via the anterior cingulate cortex, this is prefrontal cortex, lead to dampened activity in the amygdala and a marked attenuation of automatic responses, comparable to shutting down the affective system. So what does this mean? So we basically already talked about this, but now we're going to understand the mechanism. So when I say emotions, so we have our PFC, we have our ACC, and then we have our amygdala and limbic system. Okay? So what tends to happen is that this thing suppresses our amygdala and our limbic system. This is where we feel negative emotions. So in cases of dissociation, we have a very strong connection of suppressing our emotional circuitry. The stronger this becomes, the more fragmented we become, okay? Second thing, the insula plays an important role in attention modulation, encoding of negative emotions, interoceptive awareness, and pain perception. Diminished activity in this area may therefore reflect reduced interoceptive or emotional awareness. So we also see in trauma, or dissociation, we have the PFC, we have the insula. And the insula is the part of our brain that deals with interoceptive awareness. So what is interoceptive awareness? Interoceptive awareness is like the ability to know where you are. So you're like, I'm in myself, I am myself, I'm in my body. Like this is... I am once again wondering if I even exist, right? So this is like a lack of interoceptive awareness. So how do you know you exist? Like this is kind of weird, right? So let's like talk about this for a second. It's so weird. So how do you know you exist? Like let's understand this. Like forget about spirit or soul or any of that crap Atman. Let's be scientific. So how do we know that we see? We know that we see because we have photoreceptors in the eye. Our photoreceptors then transmute stuff from our retina through the optic nerve all the way back to our occipital cortex, which is in the back. And then the occipital cortex does some stuff and then, we see. How do we know that we exist? There's a part of the brain that tells you exist. That's how you know. This part of the brain is the insula. Problematic in people who have dissociation. absolutely swollen in people who meditate a lot. A lot of insular changes in meditation. So the part of our brain that literally tells us that we exist becomes compromised in some way when we are traumatized. Now, the really interesting thing, where's our salience? Okay, we're going to talk about salience in a second, is that the insula, this is what's fascinating, the part of our brain that tells us that we exist also tells us when we feel pain and when we have negative emotion. And think about this for a second. Why would these be the same part of the brain? Isn't like the sense of self in pain like different things? No. When you are in pain, who's in pain? I am in pain. When you are hurting, when you feel ashamed, you can't feel shame without a sense of I. Now, this is very important to understand because a lot of the insula is related to, we have two classes of emotions. We have our primitive emotions, which come from the amygdala, and then we have our social emotions, which come from somewhere else. Let's say the insula is connected to it. So an alligator can feel fear and anger because its amygdala is intact. An alligator doesn't feel guilt, at least not that we're aware of. Does that make sense? So there are some emotions that can happen independently, and some emotions that require a social structure to feel. So I can be stuck on a desert island and I can feel anger and I can feel fear. But if I'm stuck on a desert island and there's no human beings, I can't feel shame. There's no who's looking at me. I can be run around, I can be overweight, I can have my junk hanging out, and I'm going to be vibing like I don't give a shit because there's no one else to judge me. And then if we sort of stop and think about it, what are these negative emotions? Shame and guilt. Shame and guilt cannot exist without a sense of self. Does that make sense? I don't need to know who I am to feel fear. Like, if a fucking giant python is chasing me, I don't need, like, it doesn't matter that I'm a doctor or a dad or a man or a gamer or a good gamer, god tier gamer, shit gamer. None of that matters when there's a giant python chasing me. But in order to feel shame and guilt, I need a sense of self. So that comes from the insula. And this is also why if we look at like borderline personality disorder, what are the emotions that they feel the most intensely? There's intense shame. These affective emotions, these relational emotions become very, very intensified. And BPD is associated with dissociation. Okay? So it isn't just, and then pain is involved too. So this is where like things get kind of like, it's not black or white. So what we tend to see is that dissociation is overwhelming negative emotions. Sometimes it is fear, sometimes it is anger. That can be triggered by it, for sure, right? Because we looked at the PFC and the amygdala. So that's a connection between suppressing our primitive emotions, but there's also this other layer at the level of insula. These are two independent circuits. This is also why dissociation and depersonalization are heterogeneous experiences. They're not all one way. And your dissociation and someone else's dissociation may be different. I've seen cases where people are very primitive emotion focused and people who are very like affective or relational emotional focused. These are different. And even if we look at this concept of dissociation and depersonalization, these are not the same things. To be dissociated is you being disconnected from what is outside of you. Depersonalization is being disconnected from yourself. So am I disconnected from the outside world, like all this stuff is happening around me and I'm kind of floating around and here I am, or I don't even feel like me? Right? And there's probably like there's interesting cases of this part of feeling yourself being screwed up in other ways. So there's this really fascinating condition called the Cotard delusion. And the Cotard delusion is characterized by someone feeling like a part of their body is dead, rotting, or dying. And it's like, if you stop and think about that, like what's going on in their brain. So when you talk to someone who has the Cotard delusion, they'll be like, a part of me is dead. I have like a dead part inside of me. My liver has died. There's a rotting liver inside of me. And you'll be like, what does that mean? Like, no, like your liver function tests are fine. The ultrasound looks good. Like we did, we looked at like your arterial circulation and liver looks fine. And they're like, no, it's dying. Something's wrong. And if you kind of think about that, what is happening in their brain? There is a part of your brain that tells you that you are alive and vital. That part of the brain gets messed up. That's what the insula may be related to. I don't really know the neuroscience of the Cotard delusion. I don't know if anyone's really figured it out. Okay? So the insula is impaired. The next thing that we're going to talk about, I'm going to actually pause for a second. So I need to know from y'all, is this too complicated or does this make sense? Because I was like really struggling to figure out how much neuroscience to include. So I kind of need to know, are y'all following this or... Okay, because this is like dense neuroscience, okay? Okay, good. Okay, so if I like leave y'all behind, y'all need to let me know, okay? Because this is like some complex stuff. All right. And then we'll do Q&A later. Okay? Cool. I'm so thrilled that y'all are like able to follow this because, you know, this is dense. Like, look at this sentence. This is what the fuck. Like, we're going to just read this sentence, okay? The PCC is a critical node of the default mode network, a brain network that has been implicated in inward-directed self-referential processes such as episodic memory encoding, retrieval, self-monitoring, daydreaming, planning, rumination, and pain processing. Okay? So I'll explain what this means, okay? So then we also have this part of our brain called the posterior cingulate cortex. So the PCC is focused on inward and self-referential processes. So further evidence of altered self-referential processing in depersonalization disorder. Patients stem from an fMRI study that's looking at blood flow in the brain, in which DDD, depersonalization derealization disorder, patients were exposed to either their own photographs or a stranger's face. While viewing their own photographs, patients showed stronger activities in areas implicated in self-referential processing, which was positively correlated with depersonalization severity. Okay, so what does this mean? So there's this part of our brain called the posterior cingulate cortex. And the posterior cingulate cortex is involved in us recognizing us. Okay, so I'm going to try to find... So when we look at this image, okay? So when we look at this, okay? Are these the same person or is this one person? So when your posterior cingulate cortex is messed up, you think that these are two different people. So they've done studies, okay? Where they'll have you, like in that study, like this is what they do in that study, okay? They have you look at a picture of your face and they have you look at a picture of somebody else's face. And then normally when we see our face, our brain is like, hey, look, there's me. But when we suffer from a depersonalization disorder, we look at our face and we don't see ourselves. We see a different person. This isn't us. And I saw a hilarious like this is the I'm gonna hold on a second. I'm gonna show you all this TikTok because I think this is really great. Right? So this is like, if you guys have not seen this TikTok, this is an example of like, this is how the insula forms. I mean, so posterior cingulate cortex forms. What we're going to see in real time, if y'all have seen this is going to be the insula forming, okay?
You look so pretty.
Who looks so pretty?
Carrie, you look so pretty.
Who?
Carrie looks so pretty.
Who?
You look so pretty, Daddy.
What girl?
That girl on your phone.
Charlie, that's you. That's you, Charlie.
That's the insula.
I think you're really pretty.
Yeah.
That's it. Right? Like, this is crazy. Like, you can see it in that moment, like in this girl's face. Like, she looks at this, she doesn't understand, right? So this is like, this happens when we're young. Okay? We don't realize that we're us. And then I love it, right? It's very wholesome and cute and stuff like that. But this, her brain doesn't understand. And then in that moment, she's like, hold on a second. This is me? What? It's beautiful. You see the moment that the posterior cingulate cortex is like, that's me. Oh, whoa. Hold on a second. And if you are someone who struggles with dissociation or depersonalization, you are first 20 seconds of Charlie. You're not last 20 seconds of Charlie. And we have these studies that show that when you look at your own face, you don't see yourself. Okay? Now, here's the other really interesting thing. So when we look at the posterior cingulate cortex, there's a lot of self-referential processing that goes on in there, but there are also other things. So the PCC is also part of the default mode network. We've talked a lot about the default mode network, so we're not going to go into too much detail, but it's basically our sense of self, which is not localized to one part of the brain. It's an integration of different things. And we know that the default mode network, when it becomes overactive, we actually result in depression. So mood disorders usually involve an overactive default mode network. So that may sound kind of weird, but let's understand this, right? So in a mood disorder, I'm always beating myself up. My family's better off without me. It's my fault that this went wrong. It's my fault that this went wrong. When my partner is abusing me, it's my fault. My fault. Me. We see hyperactivity of the default mode network in depression. This is the opposite in some ways of dissociation or depersonalization. Because in depersonalization, even when it's you, it's not you. So this is what's really interesting. So let me ask y'all something. Okay? If dissociation is on one end of the spectrum and has a, let's say, hypoactive default mode network, and major depression is on the other end of the spectrum and it has a hyperactive default mode network, what is something that we can do to treat someone's depression? Can y'all guess? Right? So over here, right, perfect. Make them dissociate. Absolutely, we can make them dissociate. And we do make them dissociate. And chatters and figure this out. This is what ketamine does. Ketamine is a dissociative agent. It was originally used in anesthesia. So once again, let's think about this because this is fascinating. In dissociation, we have analgesia, reduction of pain signals, reduction of awareness. So what do we do in an anesthesia? We make people dissociate. You won't have memories of the procedure. You won't feel pain. Your consciousness is altered. Perfect. It's going to be great. We're going to induce dissociation. And the fastest acting treatment for depression that we have is ketamine. Has its own set of problems. And why? It's because it induces dissociation. Here you are beating yourself up all the time. I have a cool idea. Let's just depersonalize you for a little bit. And people feel so much relief. The challenge with ketamine is that sometimes people can get hooked to it because it's a drug of abuse. So the problem when we look at depression and ketamine is that it works while it's floating around in your system and you're dissociating. But when you replug to yourself, whatever was negative in there may still be there in some form. So I worked with some clinicians who would say like, oh yeah, like I have patients who come in for daily ketamine treatments. And then I'm like kind of wondering, I'm like, how long has this been going on? They're like, for years. And I'm like, are you sure you're just not a drug dealer? Like, this doesn't sound healthy to me. Maybe, and I joke about it, but that's where, like, when I say it doesn't sound healthy, I'm not saying it isn't healthy, because it's very possible that this person's depression is so severe that is the only thing that works, right? So there's like, And usually people who are, the colleagues that I'm talking to are actually experts in it. So they're the ones that have the most severe patients. That's what's both good and bad about training at a place like MGH, is it's this like world-class hospital where like the most severe cases from literally all over the world will travel there, and then they'll get treatment from these people. And so maybe in severe cases, this is really what's necessary. Okay. And one of the contraindications for ketamine treatment is like dissociative episodes. So this is just important to understand, kind of going back to the point here, is that we know that dissociation and depersonalization involve a separation of the self. And when we have a hyperactive self, we can dissociate them a little bit as a treatment. Okay? Now, the next thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is, let's talk about overmodulation and undermodulation. Okay, so once we're talking about the depersonalization element, once we're entering the PCC and the insula territory, I am once again even wondering if I don't exist. Okay. No, I can't find it. Hold on, chat. Give me a second. There's one more thing I want to show y'all. I hope I can find the reference. I mean, I can just explain it without showing you the reference, but I want to show you the reference, so bear with me. Here we go. It's on page 6. Here we go. Okay. Oh, it's right here. Okay, cool. So one other thing I want to show y'all, okay? Based on our recent neuroimaging findings in PTSD, Lanius and colleagues proposed a neurobiological model that distinguishes between two types of responses to traumatic reminders and other stressors. So this is what's kind of confusing in people with PTSD, or not just PTSD, just dissociative disorders. So remember that what we have is we have a unplugging from reality, and we have an intrusion, or even an intrusion experience of not reality. So either I'm unplugging from my emotions, or my emotions are over-plugging into me. And what we find is that pattern of like, oh, now like I'm feeling anxious even though there's nothing wrong, and at other times I should be feeling anxious and I feel totally fine. Like, what the fuck is going on? So it turns out that we know that there's a neurobiological mechanism for that thing. Patients with a dissociative response subtype are thought to overmodulate their emotions, as opposed to patients who primarily suffer from re-experiencing symptoms, including affective hyperarousal, intense feelings of shame and guilt, and difficulties in emotion downregulation. Emotion overmodulation, that means we're toning emotions down, dissociative response type, is thought to primarily activate blah, 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 blah. The reverse pattern, diminished frontal recruitment, ACC and MPFC, and hyperactivity in the amygdala and insula is assumed to underlie emotion undermodulation. Okay, so the main thing here is that we see both types. So going back to this diagram, so remember we talked about this where the PFC is suppressing our negative emotion. So what we tend to see in one model, this connection is really strong, and in another model, this is not very strong, and we get hyperactivity of emotion. Okay, so both of these things exist. So this is what's kind of confusing. This just goes back to the fragmentation. When we're in this state, we have overmodulation, i.e. we're toning down the signal way too much. And when we're in this state, we have undermodulation. So now the negative emotional circuitry of our brain is going haywire. And remember that this paper is talking about, once again, like, I hope this is starting to connect. So intense feelings of shame and guilt, right? So this is and this is related, this reversed pattern is related to the insula. And what does the insula do? Did I write it down? Did we do this? Okay, we didn't write it down. So what does the insula do? The insula is self-referential, right? So we kind of see that like hopefully stuff is like starting to click, where basically like we suppress emotions and then we feel dissociated. And then we feel these intense feelings of shame and guilt. And what do we see is hyperactive in our brain in those moments? What's hyperactive in our brain is our self-referential parts of the brain, which are kind of suppressed in other times. So that's what's so confusing about dissociation and depersonalization. Unlike something like a mood disorder, where we just know it's just simple, is just hyperactivity. Okay? What happens in dissociation and depersonalization is we have a fracturing and separate thing of the brain. So instead of balance, we have overmodulation or suppression of emotions on one day, and we have hyperactivity of emotions on a different day. We also know that there are subtypes of people and diseases. So I'm saying on one day you're this way, on one day you're that way, because there is suppression and intrusive thinking. That's very common. But then we also know that amongst different kinds of patients, they have a preference for one or the other. So some people are much more likely, so in BPD, for example, and now we get to the diagnoses, okay? So in BPD, for example, these people are undermodulators. So if you have a history of trauma, you can, when you're a tiny little baby seed of trauma, you can bloom into all kinds of different plants. So one plant that you will become will be a BPD plant. And in a BPD plant, we have undermodulation of our emotions. At the same time, even though we have undermodulation of our emotions, so I feel intense shame, I feel intense guilt, what that can then do is trigger that freeze response in dissociation. So this is what's really important to understand, okay? This is the sequence. In BPD, we have undermodulation. Jesus, I haven't even gotten halfway. Of emotion. So then I feel intense shame and guilt. This triggers freeze response. And dissociation. Right? And once I trigger the freeze response and dissociation, undermodulation of emotion, this is insula that is very active. And what happens when I dissociate? Insula activity goes down. Right? So then we have the other version. Overmodulation. So this is highly active PFC or insula suppression. This results in numbness, right? So we can see that dissociation, even on a neurobiological level, is a compensation for overwhelming emotion. And so the dissociation that someone with BPD experiences is a problem, but it is a solution to a different problem. And we know that if you have BPD, this is your picture. If you have DDD, depersonalization, derealization disorder, this may be more of your picture. And both of these are all related to trauma. Okay? Now there's one last thing that I want to talk about, because this is just too important to pass up. And I got to find the part once again. Give me a second, chat. Okay. So there's okay. So increased recruitment of the PFC lead to the dampened activity in the amygdala and a marked attenuation of automatic responses comparable to shutting down the affective system. Okay, so this is what we just talked about, right? So remember that your PFC shuts down your amygdala. We're going to suppress your emotion. This is a huge problem. Okay, so now we get to this. Why is this a problem? So this is a problem because the amygdala is fundamentally involved in salience detection and emotion processing, such as the initiation of stress and fear response. So the last thing that we absolutely need to talk about is salience. So salience is importance. So the problem is that a lot of these circuits are involved in the process of salience. So salience is like basically how our brain knows whether something is important or not important. And what happens when we shut off these circuits of the brain is we lose the capacity to tell what is important or not important. And what I mean by lose the capacity to tell what is important, I'm not talking about like analytically. I'm talking about in the deeper circuits of your brain. Up here, you know that shit matters. You know it's important to wake up every day. You know it's important to go to your job. You know it's important to work on your resume. You know it's important to eat healthy. You know it's important to do yoga. You know it's important to exercise. You know all of these things up here. But what happens in people who are traumatized and who have dissociation and depersonalization is they cannot bring themselves to do what is important. Like, I just don't feel like it. I feel numb. I have no idea what the fuck I'm doing in life. Right? Like, I don't feel connected to the world. I look around and I see other people feeling passion. I don't feel passion. I don't know, like, what I'm doing. I'm just kind of existing. What is the core problem here is a loss of salience. So in the primitive circuits of our brain, when they feel like something is important, that drives us to action. So when we unplug ourselves, when we dissociate, we lose access to parts of our brain making things matter to us. And when we lose the ability of things to matter, that's when we end up in these kinds of spaces, right? Then I detach from my body and go into the spirit realm. And like, that's kind of nice, but then like life stops mattering. We can't bring ourselves, we become amotivated. This is the paralysis of initiation. We start existing. We're just existing instead of living because we lose this capacity for salience. There's also a lot of other things that go on here. So like when we talk about, in our trauma guide, we dive into a lot about this process. I'm going to just speed run it real quick because this is, we literally have hours and hours of stuff on this. Right? So then the other problem is that when I fracture the self, now, like when all of my salience comes from here, this is where salience comes from. But now it's separated from my sensory input, my memories, my sense of identity. Nothing like who I am does not relate. Like the part of me that cares about stuff is separated from who I am. So the sense of identity gets messed up. And once my sense of identity gets messed up, and we're going to just once again kind of talk about this very quickly, what we know, oh shit, I'm not even screen sharing. Sorry. Let me do that again. So the problem is that this stuff over here, this is where salience is. So this is where our brain, this is like where we feel things are important. So when things are important to us, that's when we get motivation. That's when we're willing to make sacrifice. That's when our brain and our attention stays focused. So once we lose salience, like our sense of identity like disappears with it because I'm just around. I'm just a pile of sensory inputs with memories and like motor activity. That's what it means to be depersonalized. You recognize that there's sensory input. I'm seeing things. You recognize that you're doing things. Now I'm eating something and the food has a taste. And I remember that I used to do this before and I enjoyed it in the past kind of. But I'm not really living because the importance and the value comes from here, these circuits of the brain. So what we tend to see in people who have dissociation and depersonalization is they have a lack of a sense of identity. And that's because our identity comes from a couple of very specific things. Our identity comes from the narrative integration of emotional experiences. Right? So when I think about myself, who is Dr. K? Dr. K used to be a video game addict who failed out of college and then went to India and became a monk and found himself. I tell this story about who I am. That's not really who I am, right? Because that story is just, what is it? It's the emotional highlights of my life. Or the lowlights too, because they're not all good. But if you really look at it, I mean, there's like 10,000 hours of Diablo 2 in that story. But like that doesn't become a part of my identity, right? So it's not, our identity is not made up of what we do on a day-to-day basis. It is made up of an integration of emotional experiences. And then I had that breakup, and then I fell in love, and then I showed them that a week before my wedding, they reached out and they said, hey, will you give me another chance? And I was like, fuck you. That's my identity. Right? Like, and so this is what happens with dissociation and depersonalization is we lose our sense of identity. When we lose our sense of identity, we lose our motivation. What am I doing in life? I don't know. I'm just a fucking pile of sensory inputs, memories, and motor inputs. This is not a person. Okay? Because we're segregating this out. So what we know is that developing a narrative is very, very helpful for the healing of trauma. Okay? So, like, we'll talk about this a lot in the guide where there's like, videos on integrating your emotions and stuff like that. We'll get to that, some of that stuff in a minute, but definitely check that out if you guys are interested in this. So there's also like all these different dimensions that we haven't talked about. So remember that, just to give you all a couple of examples. So remember that the dissociation is a response to overwhelming activity. So there are particular physiologic techniques that you can use to downregulate that activity. And if you downregulate the activity, you no longer need to dissociate to protect yourself. If you no longer need to dissociate, then you have a sense of identity. Then you can integrate that emotional experience. So avoiding dissociation is part of the path of healing. We need to integrate those emotional responses. We need to not trigger that dissociation. We need to feel what we need to feel. We need to calm down our physiology. And so all that stuff is laid out in the guide. How do you do that in a step-by-step manner? Okay? I'm not saying that, I'm saying that because this is not a complete, it's just way more than we can cover today. That's my point. We're going to talk about what to do in a second. So before we do that, though, I want to talk about gaming in the internet. So now we have a huge problem. So if we look at the world today, what we see is problems of dissociation and depersonalization manifesting in a ton of people who do not have diagnoses of depersonalization disorder, borderline personality disorder, derealization disorder, dissociative identity disorder. Okay? We see a lot of amotivation. We see a lot of I'm just existing. We see a lot of I should do this one day, I should do this one day, I should do this one day. We see a lot of shame and guilt. Right? I'm ashamed of myself for whatever reason. And what's going on here? So I think what's happening is if you look at dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder, right? So these are situations where, once again, the mind fragments into different things. And sometimes what can happen is these fragments can start to develop. So it's like what I'm going to do is clone myself. I'm going to split myself into two human beings, and I'm going to level myself up in these different places. So now like Dr. K, like Dr. Jekyll is over here, Mr. Hyde is over here, and then I alternate between the two, and whichever one I am is the one that I level up on a particular day. So over time, these identities start to become more concreted. They become more solid. So now what we're seeing on the internet is that the virtual world allows us to do this process better. The virtual world intersects in so many ways along this dissociation and depersonalization axis. So just to give you all a couple of examples, right? So let's run through the stuff that we talked about, and y'all tell me whether the internet and technology enhances what we're talking about or depletes what we're talking about. Emotional numbness. Technology enhances or depletes emotional numbness. Being able to be one thing in one moment and another thing in another moment. When I play World of Warcraft, I am a guild leader who is feared and respected. every day I get messages from noobs asking to join my guild. And in the real world, I work at a checkout counter from 9 to 5. And then I hate going to work. And then I post on the internet about, is this what life is? This feels like a bad deal. To work for 40 years of my life from 9 to 5, hate that part of my life for 2 hours of enjoyment being my work wow guild leader self. This sounds like shit. This is a raw deal. So there's this sentiment that is growing, right? That like work is bad and all I want to do is hang out and play video games all day. This feels like a raw deal. And then we get mad at the billionaires, which I'm not saying that they're free of criticism. By all means, criticize them. But we have to understand that there can be problems in the world and there can be problems in ourself. Okay? So what we also see in dissociative identity disorder is the daydreaming is another aspect of it. So do we see that in the virtual world? Do we see the development of alternate identities? So this is really important to understand. So what we tend to see in these studies, right? So this is just one study, but there's others. So let's talk about this for a second. Okay. So figure 1, the psychic pit model on the developmental roots of problematic internet use. So this is what happens. There's childhood experiences of loss, neglect, or abuse, unresolved states of mind regarding attachment, dissociation and absorption to the internet to protect the self from traumatic memories, and then problematic internet use. This is the psychic pit model. Okay? So like what this is kind of saying is if we look at the virtual world, what we find is that people who get addicted to the internet usually have a history of trauma or neglect. Now, this is also changing a little bit because as the internet becomes more addictive, the amount of trauma or neglect we need to get addicted is going down. So now we used to have severely damaged people who would have addictions. But as the addictive potency of the thing goes up, we don't need to be quite as damaged to get addictive. Then what happens is we have these different problems. So like in this paper, they really focus on attachment theory and our ability to form bonds. So when we have difficulty forming bonds with other human beings, the internet offers us this place to form bonds in an easier way. It allows us to dissociate from our lives. And now I have all these friends online. I can hang out with people on Discord all the time, but I'm socially anxious in the real world. So what I'm doing is I'm separating myself out. I'm literally dissociating and fragmenting my identity into these two people. And then here's the real problem. I am investing all of my energy, all of my motivation, all of my drive, and all of my passion into the dissociated self, into the virtual identity. I am grinding for 10 hours a day to get this mount. And then we look at the rest of life and we say, I don't want to participate in this. Why can't I participate in this? And if you really pay attention, what you'll find is that in the virtual world, we feel safe. So in the virtual world, we don't need to separate and numb ourselves because it feels safe. And since it feels safe, all of the emotional energy can come out. And since all of the emotional energy can come out, we can avoid the paralysis of initiation. There is salience. Things feel important to us. The insula does not need to be suppressed when we are in the virtual world. And this is the basic problem. If any of y'all are ever wondering, why the fuck can I not live my life with passion, but I can grind at this game for 10 hours a day? This is the reason. When I ask you, when you are playing the game, does it feel important? Your logical mind will say it is not important. But I ask you, does it feel important? You say yes. You are connected to your salience when you're in the virtual world because it feels safe. It helps you manage your emotions. When we look at the virtual world, we get this, right? So we have something that will modulate our emotions for us. We can allow ourselves to feel. When we're playing on the internet, we are more integrated between identity, emotions, safety. And so we go on investing in this version of ourselves. And when we invest in this version of ourselves, then we hate the rest of it. And even if you say okay, logically, I know that the virtual world isn't real, but we're not talking about logic. We're talking about the primitive parts of your brain, right? So we haven't talked about many cortical structures here. This is all deeper stuff. So what we're seeing in social media is literally the creation. I want y'all to think about Charlie and the self-recognizing parts, right? So we talked about this study where when people with dissociation look at depersonalization, look at pictures of themselves, they don't see themselves. What do you think filters do to that part of your brain? When you create a version of yourself that you love more using a filter, and then you look in the mirror and you don't see the good version of yourself, what do you think happens? Activation of shame and guilt. And then in the real world, when I look at myself in the mirror, I feel shame and guilt. Trigger dissociative mechanisms. Cool. Dissociative mechanisms. Shut off the shame and guilt. When I trigger that dissociation, I lose salience. I lose importance. I lose motivation. So what do? I don't do anything to fix my appearance. I log online. I play a game for a few hours, and then the cycle repeats itself. So everything that the virtual world is offering us allows us to lean into these dissociative mechanisms. So now the question is, what do we do about it? So I've got a couple of answers for you in no particular order. The first thing is that we know that trauma-related treatment is very effective. Okay? So there are things like EMDR. And EMDR, I think it works pretty well. I don't practice EMDR, but I've seen very good outcomes on an anecdotal level with it. There are a lot of people in the academic community who think that EMDR is overblown. Eye movement desensitization retraining or something like that. But basically what happens in EMDR, we go into a lot of detail in the guide. Basically what happens in EMDR is we recall traumatic memories, but since we are doing a particular attentional task, we can go through the traumatic memory without it triggering the emotional response. So now we can integrate this part back into ourselves without it being emotionally overwhelming and triggering the dissociation. So I can touch that thing without it feeling overwhelmingly hot that I have to retreat from. So this is very effective. I think psychotherapy is quite effective for things like dissociation. And there are particular kinds of psychotherapy like EMDR that may be more effective. Your mileage may vary, and it's not like a consensus opinion. Okay? Second thing is we have to learn how to feel. And if we look at what EMDR is, that's the general goal, right? So even if you don't have a history of dissociation, dissociative identity disorder or something like that. So if you've got one of those diagnoses, definitely you need to seek medical care. Okay, there's no question about that. Like I would not go coaching or meditate your way through this. If you've got something that qualifies as a diagnosable disorder, you should be in treatment. That is the right answer. I'm not saying that you can't get better without it, but on balance, that is absolutely the right answer. But the second thing that we can do is we can look at, okay, what is the overall goal of that? What does that treatment accomplish? So what the treatment really accomplishes is the integration of self. That is our overarching goal. So you must become a complete person. And what do we mean by complete person? We mean all of those aspects of identity need to be there. So sense of self, memory, emotion, motivation, sensory experience, motor activity, level of consciousness. All of that stuff needs to be integrated. Now, what is the problem with integration? The problem with integration is that the emotions are usually overwhelming. Right? So if we look at like a lot of these brain circuits, they come down to emotion. That's what we're focusing on today. I mean, they really come down to everything. Just to kind of give you all a quick example, right? So let's remember that, like, I mean, we can't do this in 2 hours because this is everything, right? We're not even talking about language processing. We talk about that in the guide. So if you guys want a more complete version of this, you want all the other layers, check out the guide. But what we're kind of focusing on today is you need these things need to be connected. So we're focusing on the anterior cingulate, the insula, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. So what we need to do in order to form healthy memories is integrate our emotional experience. Once you have a string of healthy memories, and healthy memory doesn't mean good or bad. It just means emotionally salient stuff kind of tied together and accepted. It can involve a breakup. That's fine. Doesn't have to be falling in love. You can do both. But alexithymia or emotional numbness is a huge part of this. Because when the emotion becomes too high, it triggers the dissociation. So what we need is the capacity to feel emotion without dissociating. So we have a lot of tools that we've built at HG around reducing alexithymia, understanding your emotions, sitting with your emotions. This is incredibly important. So the nice thing about even things like if you look at the internet, right? So internet involves emotional expression. People are so angry on the internet. They'll tilt. They'll call you all kinds of nasty things. So that emotion comes out there. Generally speaking, what I've observed being on the internet is that the degree of toxicity for a gamer correlates with their general unhappiness in life. Generally. Right? Because the game is really good at bringing out even the most degenerate parts out. I mean, I tilt every once in a while when I play games, but generally speaking, I'm pretty happy in life. But you have these people who are just chronically toxic and like their lives are not good. So what we have is all this emotion coming out in the virtual world instead of feeling it in the real world. So we must start feeling in the real world. It's okay to feel pain. It's okay to feel shame. It's okay to feel whatever, right? And it's really interesting. So we had an interesting post, so like, we're just going to flash this for a second. Learning how to feel my emotions and how Healthy Gamer ruined therapy for me in a good way. So this person is talking about how, so we emphasize alexithymia. And so this person was in therapy, but like this happens a lot where, whenever I talk to my therapist, I see how how much I slip into analytical mind and try to be my own therapist. I don't actually confide insecurities to her or emotions at all. It's like I need her to believe I'm improving so she doesn't give up on me. But I didn't feel that way in coaching. I did initially, but not at the end. Right? So and this person is kind of talking about talking with my coach helped me see how my emotions are connected to deeper parts of myself and how they communicate. I'm better at listening, learning to listen to intuition and pause when I feel something come up internally. So when you're dissociating, you don't have this capacity. In feeling my emotions, I can interact with people more fully and be present. I'm not great at it, but I've gotten so much better at taking a second to check in with myself and see how I'm doing emotionally. And I saw how not feeling them had overtaken me. I was acting out at small things and couldn't cope when sadness became too strong. There was only so long they could put me in a box, so now in my adulthood, they've become explosive. Right? So that they used to put their emotions in a box and now they feel explosive. So y'all can check out coaching if you want. That's not what the purpose of that is. It's just I think it's an example of someone's story of becoming more emotionally connected and less alexithymic. And by the way, that, good therapists will handle that part that, this person had. So it's not a criticism of therapy. This happens all the time in therapy. Therapists are trained to see that. Okay? The point is, when you connect with your emotions, then you will see all kinds of stuff start to happen. You need to be able to settle your emotions. You need to be able to feel your emotions. You can't dissociate away from them. Okay? Next thing that we need to do is strengthen our brain circuits. So this is related to lexithymia, but the reason that we tell y'all about these kinds of things is that when we talk about neuroscience, this is not just about understanding. It is also about intervention. And I love it that you guys got this right, because I asked you, if this is the problem in depression, what is the treatment? And if you understand the brain science, I want y'all to really understand this. Y'all, over the course of this lecture, figured out what MD PhDs who make billions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies, they are utilizing the same approach to develop drugs. They're looking at this brain science and they're saying, this is what we need to do. And they are utilizing ketamine, because ketamine has been used in anesthesia for like 100 years. Only recently did it start getting used in depression. So some 5-head MD PhD at like Stanford School of Medicine or Harvard Medical School came up with some treatment working with Pfizer. And y'all fucking 3 heads figured it out. So if you understand the brain science, you will be able to implicitly understand what you need to do. We've tried to break that down for you some. Right? So now, like, what are the components? The first thing is recognize that if you're struggling with a motivation, you need salience. If you're not going to get salience with emotional numbness. Sense of self involves integration of emotional experiences and forming a narrative. So start to form a narrative of your life. Who are you? And you say, I don't know. The other thing to understand is when we talk about trauma, there's 2 or 3 different layers that we need to address. So one is this neuroscience level where we want to meditate and get reconnected with our insula. We want to become a less alexithymic. All that stuff is good in there. We want to adjust our hyperarousal. We want to work on things like daydreaming and attentional control. All that stuff is there. But then there are 2 other aspects that we need to dive into, which we just don't have, the time for the detail today. The first is we need to re-engage with relationships. So as long as our relationships are absent from our life, this becomes very difficult. So if we look at the psychic PIC model and on the developmental roots of problematic internet use, it involves attachment disorganization. This is step number 2. So let's understand this, okay? I only need to dissociate and numb my emotions when I can't share them with someone else. So as a human being, the amount of emotion that I experience is by definition more than I can handle. I experience more emotions than I can handle. You experience more emotions than you can handle. The whole human race can feel more emotions than they can handle. Which is why we evolved in communities. So if you look at what humans do for each other, and not just humans, animals do this for us as well. So we know that animals can improve depression, can improve anxiety, I think extend lifespan by like 4 years. Like, that's nuts. Could be wrong on the number. It's been a while since I looked at the research. So as human beings, we are not designed to handle our own emotions. We're designed to handle them in concert. So as long as you are disconnected from other human beings, this is going to be very difficult. The good news is when you connect to other human beings and you share with them and they share with you, it strengthens everybody. And now you don't need to dissociate to deal with your emotions. The crux of this, at least the answers that I'm sort of offering, is hypotheses, really. The answer is to avoid the dissociative process. Why does the dissociative process happen? Because of extensive overblown emotion. So let's target that. There are other studies that show, we didn't get into much detail around this, but I can show you all real quick. Give me a second. Hold on, chat. Here we go. Right? So then we've got like some of these papers too. So we can't go over all this, but, you know, trauma and anxious attachment influence in the relationship between suggestibility and dissociation, right? So anxious attachment, dissociation, a model of dissociation based on attachment theory and research. Okay. So we have like a lot of papers that suggest that dissociation is fundamentally connected to the way that we relate to other human beings. If we can't connect to another human being, we won't connect to ourselves. And there's so much research that shows us that the way that our sense of identity is based relationally. Even our own understanding of our own emotions is determined by emotional mirroring from our caregivers. So if you're alexithymic, the number one cause of alexithymia is a lack of mirroring by other people. And this works very simply. So if I'm a baby, I don't know what I'm feeling. Like, I don't know. Like, I just feel all this pile of stuff. So how do I figure out what I'm feeling? I pay attention to the people around me. Right? This is a great example of this is baby is running and falls. And then for a flash of an instant, they look at the people around them. They look at the adults. If the adults laugh, they laugh. If the adults are like, oh my God, then the baby starts crying. The baby doesn't know. Is this funny or is this dangerous? I don't know. So they look at the people around them. And then the people are like, oh my God. And the baby's like, oh, fuck. This is dangerous. And then they start crying. And then the adult picks them up. They're like, it's okay, baby. It's okay. It's okay. And then the baby kind of calms down. It's like, okay, cool. So if you look at what's going on, and there's so much significance there. Now, who is managing my emotions? Someone else is managing my emotions. And the weird thing about that is when someone else manages my emotions, I learn how to manage my own emotions. It may sound like a contradiction, but it isn't. When people around me speak English, I learn how to speak English. When people around me express politeness, I learn how to express politeness. Babies learn through observation, not self-reflection. Absurd. And so we learn how to contain and manage our own emotions through the modeling of the people around us. So we must re-engage in healthy relationships. This is critical for dissociation. Okay? And if we look at like the roots of all these fucking dissociative disorders, trauma, especially around your early caregivers, is like a number one risk factor because that's what was broken. That's what has to be fixed. So forming healthy relationships is critical. The last thing is like, this is kind of more abstract, is that we have to learn how to live life. We can't retreat from life anymore. And the problem is that it's easy to retreat from life because life is shit. But it's only shit until we start engaging with it. So right now, what goes on with so many people that I work with, see, talk to, is that they're separating their life into two chunks. One is their virtual life and one is their real life. And everyone is retreating away from the real life and leaning into the virtual life. They're like, oh my God, is my whole life just working for 40 years and then I get to play games on the weekend and like, what the fuck, this sucks. And my antidote to that is that like, start living a life that is worth living, right? It takes work. But the more that, I don't know, like when I play fucking video games for 8 hours a day, I don't feel like doing anything in my life. I don't feel like working out. I don't feel like eating healthy. I don't feel like working on a book. I don't feel like doing anything. But I do want to get better at the game. And so the more that we invest into this dissociated part of ourselves, the less we want to invest in this other part. I'm not saying that this is easy. The last thing I'm telling y'all is the hardest thing. Start to live life. And even if you're unhappy with your job, this isn't I'm supposed to work for 40 years and then like I get to retire and then have fun. No. The whole point, what we try to teach y'all is how to make your day-to-day life enjoyable and livable. Sometimes it involves changing your job. Sometimes it involves changing your attitude. Sometimes it involves doing something else. Right? There are parts of my job that I don't like. There have been parts of my job that I disliked before. And when I had a job before that, when I had a job, my first job was serving ice cream. There are parts of that job that I didn't like. There are always going to be parts of life that you don't like. I don't think you should resign yourself to living exclusively those things and that's how it's going to be for the next 40 years. You adapt what you can, you change what you can, you accept what you can't, and you try to do better tomorrow. But the ultimate antidote to dissociation is like not stopping to live life. It is like starting to re-engage with life. And we know that having a healthy relationship is a good prognostic factor for resolution of symptoms of BPD. Now, a lot of people will interpret this as, oh, I need a relationship in order to be fixed from BPD. No, you don't. That's black and white thinking. That's a feature of BPD. But start to live life. That's ultimately the best answer. And now you'll say, but I can't live life. The whole problem is that when I try to live life, this happens. I'm not actually living life. Or this happens. Or this happens. And that's okay. Like this is going to happen for a time. But as you start reconnecting with your emotions, as you start feeling safe, as you start reconnecting with other people, as your salient circuits start to activate, as you stop relying on the teat of the virtual world for your comfort, all of these things will start to improve. I believe that. As you engage in therapy, as you do EMDR, all of that stuff will help. And there's a lot of things that we haven't even touched on. So remember that when we look at some of this stuff, right, there are like dimensions of this that we haven't even touched, which can be incredibly helpful. So one is we talked about motor inputs. We talked about motor inputs, but we haven't talked about motor input at all. But if you look at people like Bessel van der Kolk, so he runs this absolute Chad trauma researcher and clinician. He runs this place called the Trauma Center. And foundational for him is doing yoga. I don't know where he's from. I don't know if it's like German or Austrian or Swiss or whatever. I don't know that, or maybe he's Dutch. I don't know. But like, you know, he's not Indian, I think. But there's a lot of evidence that shows that even doing yoga, actually, we should probably add that to the list. So what happens with yoga is yoga gives you, or Tai Chi, gives you an embodied awareness. So when you're doing yoga, your sense of it, you are in yourself when you are doing yoga. That's very healthy. Spending time in yourself actually reduces this kind of activity. This changes when you do yoga a lot. Okay? So like dissociation and depersonalization are like huge problems. From a clinical perspective, they're quite rare, and it's a no-brainer that if you experience dissociative episodes, I'd strongly recommend you get a clinical evaluation and engage in treatment if that's necessary. But what we're also starting to see is that technology is really leaning into dissociation and depersonalization. It's enhancing it. It is feeding it. It makes it easier to do. It allows us to segregate ourselves and put a piece of us over there and a piece of us over here. And the moment that we segregate ourselves, we lose ourselves. You are not actually two things. You are one whole thing. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which means the moment that we fracture ourselves, we become less than we are. Now, this is necessary at times to survive. Dissociation is an adaptation. It happens in animals, right? And they're not all fucked up in the head. But what helped us survive yesterday is keeping us from living tomorrow. This is where we go back to the goalie. So the fundamental problem in trauma is that you start surviving life instead of living it. And why is that? It's not because you're dumb. It's because you're smart. It's because that's like you tried to live and Your brain was like, this ain't working. We just got to survive. And if you look at, if the scope is survival, you're living reactively. You're living today. You're not thinking about tomorrow. Tomorrow is about tomorrow. Let's just get through the day. And then tomorrow comes, and then it's let's get through the day. 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 I'm bored today. What am I going to do? I'm going to play a video game. I feel like I should do this. I should work on my resume, but that benefits tomorrow. Ain't nobody got time for that. The future dimension becomes atrophied in people who have a history of trauma. Their brain's ability to think and plan in the future becomes atrophied, and then they get confused. They know they should do something, but the underlying mechanisms of the brain don't know how to do it. Up here, you understand intellectually, but you can't operate. It's like you can be sitting in your car and you can be like, okay, I have to turn this and I have to push the gas pedal. But if the engine's missing, you're not going to go anywhere. This is what it's like to live with a history of trauma. The stuff on the inside is not working the way that it should. A loss of salience, a loss of emotion, a loss of the future dimension, a loss of motivation. Now, the good news, all of this can get better. So I have the most optimistic view when it comes to trauma. Why? Because we're not quite sure if anything is truly broken. These are adaptations. See, if you have something like Down syndrome or Prader-Willi or something like that, right? Some kind of chromosomal anomaly or a collagen disorder like Ehlers-Danlos, Marfan syndrome. That's like, until we figure out how to repair your genes, that's something that's fixed. You can't change that. Trauma is an adaptation that can rewire. So I've seen very severe trauma get so much better. Man, like some really just intense suffering of people with BPD, these people get better. Remission rate of BPD at something like 16 years is 98%. At 10 years, it's like 90%. At 7 years, it's like 85% or something like that. Even at 2 years, it's something like 40% remission. Right? So the odds are actually good because there's not something fundamentally busted. At least we have no evidence of that right now. Could be that something's fundamentally busted. But the whole point of looking at all these brain circuits and brain scans and things like that is we can understand what's going on. And it's not that the part of the brain is missing. It's not like you have a stroke. It is a connectivity issue. This part is overmodulating this part. This part is undermodulating this part. This part is dormant. This part is underconnected. We can fix all of those things. So don't give up hope. And as you're listening to this, if this applies to you, you won't feel anything, which is fine. Right? Because the salience parts are messed up. So what I'm telling you may be intellectually important, but on the inside, you're like, eh. Okay? But that's okay. That's okay. Okay? That's okay. You don't need to feel all of the hope in this moment. Right? So even with the intellect, so the last thing I'll leave y'all with, right? So people are saying, I feel so dead inside. Yeah, like I get it. Right? That's okay. It's okay to feel dead inside. It doesn't mean that you will always feel dead inside, and take whatever step you can. Right? So if that's looking into EMDR, fantastic. If you guys do nothing else and this applies to you, I'd say have a consultation with someone like a therapist or a psychiatrist. That's a great first step. If that doesn't work for you, or you've already done that, or you're already in therapy, fantastic. Then do a little bit of yoga. Participate a little bit in our community events. Right? It's not a treatment for DID by any means. But all of these things, we recognize this, right? We understand this, and we're trying to build stuff for you. And I don't know if y'all remember stuff like Touch Grass and things like that. We've had some just incredibly successful, brilliant community events, right? Where we're trying to get y'all to live life. And a natural consequence of that living life is like you will have to deal with some of these things. We have the Make It May challenge going on right now, which is like we're giving y'all challenges to go and do things in your life, go and make the world a better place, learn self-expression. I think we may be on self-expression week right now. Right? So like self-expression can't happen unless you connect with something in yourself. There are a lot of studies on things like art therapy and stuff like that it's very effective. And that's because, I'm sure, I haven't looked into this, but I'm sure that the mechanisms are, it allows you to connect with yourself. Art therapy is very therapeutic. So there's all kinds of stuff that's available. Don't give up hope. Okay? Okay. So I think we're going to hop in with one of our devs real quick. And then we'll do Q&A. Okay? So we'll answer questions in a minute. We just have something cool to show you. Chat lords. Okay, so we're going to do this. And I'm going to pop out. And I'm going to do this. Can you count to 10 for me? We'll do Q&A in a second, okay, chat? Okay, oh shit.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Keep going.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay, so I'm going to turn you down a little bit. And are you going to screen share with me, Brandon?
Yes, I will screen share with you.
Okay, are you going to screen share? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Do you want to talk? I think you want to talk about the guide first, right?
Okay, sure. Yeah, but do I talk about it or you talk about it?
I can talk about it. Give me
Okay.
a sec.
Hold on, chat. So are you going to screen share with me?
Yeah, I'm screen sharing right now.
Okay. Watch stream. Okay. So we're going to do... How do I... There we go. Okay. So we're going to... Hold on. All right. Go for it. Trinian.
Yeah, so basically I just want to show off, like, we've launched our trauma module now, which is this one at the top of the map right here. Been a lot of work from everyone on the team, devs, to get the map in, design work, to get all of this like interconnectedness available on the platform, on this whole map design that we've like started since like 2021, I think.
Skilltree IRL.
Yeah, Skilltree IRL. And basically it takes you from like a sequence of paths that you can take, choose your own adventure, kind of learn more about a topic. So here in trauma, we start with like an introduction where you have an intro to trauma, you have an overview of what this module is about, going through the core sequence of trauma essentially, and then that gives you kind of like a baseline knowledge of kind of what this trauma module is about. And then it goes into the different branches of, physiology of trauma, relationships, a clinical track to more understand trauma from a clinical perspective, and then a spiritual track, which we've always included a little bit of in every single guide. And there's connections to other modules that we have, how these all connect together. But really just wanted to showcase that, this is a really big work that's been in progress for, let's say, I think 2 years, right, Dr. K?
Yes.
Yeah, so...
How long have you been working on it?
On just the trauma guide or just like
trauma
the whole
guide
thing? Oh, trauma guide for me probably has been like 6-7 months since I've been actually involved. But I think your scripting and all the filming and stuff before that.
So the dev stuff has taken about 7 months.
Yeah, that stuff has taken a good chunk.
Yeah.
And also part of this, the time invested, is because we recognize that this is a very overwhelming like skill tree, I guess, like when you first come into the guide. So what we've been working on also is creating a much more mobile friendly, just like new user friendly experience, because originally when we started this, it was just the 3 modules of anxiety, depression, and meditation, and that kind of expanded into this huge ADHD module that was added last year, and then the trauma module, which is out this year. And really this has become like a really complex and convoluted kind of map to work with, but we wanted to also showcase some of the upcoming designs that we are doing to make it a little bit more user friendly. Can you show
us that?
Yes, I can. That's
So,
the next
by
thing
the
I
way,
was
if you guys find this to be overwhelming and complex, you can thank Trinian here for fixing that, because I certainly don't give a fuck. And the greater the complexity is, the happier I feel, because this is like an IRL skill tree, as everyone is pointing out. And people are talking about like Path of Exile and stuff like that. Yeah, like that's like, I hate to break it to y'all, but understanding every aspect of yourself is not a simple endeavor. And this actually gives me immense amount of pride. I understand that it is overwhelming to navigate. I get that. And that's why we have people like Trinian, who it's his job to take this mind-boggling complexity and make it accessible for the noobs.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's like a lot, if you want to talk about Dr. K, like the research that goes behind doing all, like building a guide from the bottom up. You can talk about that because there's like four major parts.
Can you
Yeah.
show us the simplified version? I was joking about the noobs. I recognize that this is overwhelming and people don't know where to start. So can you show us? Because I've seen some of those mock-ups. Is that something that's ready to show the public or not so much?
It's still in like design form, so we haven't gotten a interactive like staging environment yet,
Yep.
but we're working on that, getting it up this week. But I'm happy to share kind of what the designs do look like.
Cool.
Instead of like and like the logic behind it. Um
Yeah, can you walk us through this? This
Yeah,
I
let's-
actually think is even arguably cooler, to be honest.
Yeah. I really like the design philosophy. So the idea is that when we want a new user to come into the guide, or even like an existing user, we want to customize the experience a little bit more and guide them through the process. So it's really like an actual guide rather than just like you come in here and you just get thrown into it and you kind of just start. Rather, we want to understand, what are you coming to the guide for? We want to make sure that when you come to the guide, if there's something that we can help you with when you're using the product, that you're able to actually be directed toward those videos.
So this is cool. So it looks like they have an option, so they can choose between guided experience used as a survey to create a tailored path through content based on your needs and interests, or open experience, which is if you want to just go through the map, you can still go through the map.
Correct. So
Okay, cool.
yeah,
That's
we
great.
wanted to preserve the map because I think the novelty of it, and also just because like you were talking about before, the whole idea is like it's very complex. It's not like being able to see all these connections and where they all connect to each other is very valuable too. But yeah, so we just start with a quiz here. This quiz allows us to understand basically what your needs are when you come to the guide, and also allows us to customize the experience later on when you get through like the introduction videos here. And this is just like an example of what the survey is. It's very simple questions. It's like on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about these specific questions? I think the max is like 15 questions that are all basically just on a scale of 1 to 5 quick answers. And then we just calculate a score in our backend, and then that allows us to determine what we would recommend you later on. So,
Can you zoom in a bit more?
What?
Can you zoom in a bit more? It's small on stream.
oh yeah, sure. Let me see if I can zoom this in here. Is this a little better?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can close this. Okay. Let me see. And then so this is like kind of the main page you land on, where now instead of like the huge map where you can see right here, there's still an option to go back to the original map here to see how it looks like on the previous view. But here we have a start here where you go with like anxiety module overview, or if you click on if you enter these different module tabs, you'll get different views on like what do we recommend if you want to watch these specific videos in each module. And what we want to do is direct you through kind of like the core knowledge. So this is like the starting path here. And the starting path contains 2, maybe like at most 5 videos of just like basic knowledge of what you should understand in the module before you continue on to kind of like the different paths that you can go down. And these paths are outlined through topics of like science of anxiety, for example, here, anxiety behavior, mastering anxiety. And the idea here is also just like if you had a specific question about anxiety, which one of these paths do you go down to get that question answered?
I'm sorry, can you say that again? Oh,
So if you have like a specific question, like here is like, what is anxiety? Where does it come from, right? If you want to
okay.
understand that a little bit more, you go down the signs of anxiety playlist
Okay,
essentially. Yeah.
so like the question sort of gives people a sense of if they're looking for the answer to that question, that's what you will find in that segment.
Yes, that's correct. So like once you've
It's
watched
super
that
cool,
beginning
man.
path, it opens up. Yep. And then here we kind of have like recommendations or highlights of understanding, based off that quiz you took at the beginning, what do we recommend for you to watch to help you kind of tackle the issues that you've indicated in that survey initially. And then, yeah, so every single module has a bunch of different paths you can go down. We've just like laid them all out here. Have a little bit, it's just a
Dude, this is
design
super
file of
cool, man.
illustrations. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good work from our designer, and also for like conceptually thinking about how to organize all these has been a lot of team efforts from everyone. So,
Yeah, this is I just show up and ramble. I think this is the hard part.
Yeah, and then also the last part here is like we want to add also a little bit of a guide to like the map itself. So maybe
So
we make the map a little bit less.
We have a guide
daunting.
to the guide.
Yes, we have a guide to the guide.
So you're telling me, Trinian, that at this point, our guide requires a tutorial.
Correct.
Okay.
Our guide requires a tutorial to understand how to work, how it works, and I think it should help in terms of
I'm
someone.
curious, do we have any plans to develop a certification that people have to go through in order to utilize the guide properly at some point? Like, is this like, are you going to need training? Formal training, or is tutorials?
I hope not. I hope it won't ever become that complicated. But yeah, so this also gives you an idea of like if you like the map view, you can use it. But also, if you are overwhelmed and you just want to understand, where can I go? What can I watch? Clicking on our little blobbo in the bottom right here will give you a recommendation saying, hey, you've watched these videos or you've answered this stuff in the quiz. Here's what we recommend you watch next.
Okay, cool.
So, yeah, that's how we've improved a little bit on the UI UX stuff. Done playlists.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah, I think everything else here. Everything else is not too different. Here's like the lesson page that we've improved a little bit in terms of the UI UX here, where we want to showcase the playlist that you're part of, like you're watching through these specific videos, and then doing these different tabs of understanding and accessing the information that's relevant to the specific lesson. So any attached meditation videos that are relevant to this lesson, or additional reading and references that I've included, or glossary terms that maybe need to be defined are included in kind of the tabular format in the description of the lesson now. Instead of right now, what it is like a big long page of just like text.
I know that we've done some like categorization of meditation videos and stuff like that. Is that a feature that you can show us?
Yeah, I think I can even. That's already live right now. So let me switch back to my browser.
So this is another challenge is that we teach a lot of meditation, and people are oftentimes wondering like, okay, what kind of meditation should I do? So can you walk us through like what this page has?
Yes. So this page has every meditation that's in the module, in all the guides. And what we've done with this most recent iteration is we've pinned this video at the top left here, which is just Dr. K, where you walking us through what you should do with meditations and how you should utilize meditations, how often should you stick to a practice before moving on to another one, and like generally like how to go about meditation practices. If you want to talk more about that, you can, but that's basically what we've done here, which is like help new users who like come here and be like, okay, where do I start? Or like what do I do with my meditation practice and how do I create a routine? This is kind of like the video to go to, and it's pinned there in every view, so people are like always aware that it's there.
Yeah. So
yeah.
And like if you guys look at the stuff at the top, because I think I'm somewhat familiar with this. So one of the challenges is we don't teach meditation quite as much on stream or at the end of lectures. But one of the challenges, one of the reasons for that is, so we've taught a lot of meditation, like on streams. The challenge, though, is that if people are like looking for how do you find the meditation that works for whatever you want to do? There's no way to index information from streams, or it's very difficult, right? Because oftentimes I'll make up something on the fly, even if we're talking about different topic. Like we can talk about generally the same topic. We can talk about trauma. We can talk about dissociation. Someone else is like, I have trouble with motivation or focus. I'll teach them some kind of meditation. So another big thing that is cool about what Trinian and the team have done is they've taken, what we've tried to do is really build a library of practices. A lot of this stuff, I'd say maybe about half of this stuff we've done on stream at some point, but it's all organized here. And then it also has like different levels of stuff. So you'll see like there's like levels of difficulty, like there's basic meditations, advanced meditations, expert meditations. And then there's like different kinds of topics that you can select and then go to like cognitive.
Yep.
And so, in the meditation guide, we talk about 4 general paths to meditation. So sometimes people will have like difficulty, like when I say, focus on the breath, that's hard for them. But if I ask someone, hey, notice how far outside of your nostrils your breath extends, adding an inquisitive aspect to it, like trying to figure something out. Where does your breath go inside your body? Where do you feel the most vibration from Om chanting? Giving some people a question to answer in meditation keeps it very focused on, allows them to stay focused on the task, as opposed to doing something repetitively. That gets boring for some people. So we've tried to really build this meditation index, and each guide comes with about a dozen meditations. And then, so it's like if y'all are getting kind of overwhelmed, like that's what this is for.
Yep.
Cool.
And there's always like favoriting also, where you can favorite specific ones that you think are useful to you. You can favorite those ones and get access to them easily too.
Awesome, Brandon. Anything else that you wanted to share with us?
Just wondering, like, do you have anything to talk about in terms of like when you're building a guide from the ground up, like the research that goes into it, all the scripting and the experience of filming with Big Cow or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So I can talk about that a little bit. So I think that, what you guys see here is gorgeously designed and stuff like that. The devs put a lot of effort into it, right? And there's a team of people that have been working on this for about 7 months is like their main goal, I think. Maybe I'm wrong there, but when we build a guide, it's like, so just to give you all an example, there's a chance that our next guide will be addiction. And the guide to addiction technically started 5 years ago. So oftentimes before we build a guide, we've known that we wanted to do something that's trauma related, but even like what should be included and what should not be included. So for 4 years, we've been streaming, and we'll stream topics related to trauma. And then what happens is we'll see posts, right? Like people will say like, oh, but what about this? And what about this? And, I tried this and this doesn't work. And so over time, the first step to building a guide is paying attention to what y'all need from us and what y'all can find elsewhere. So the first idea is like, okay, for people with a history of trauma, and trauma is tricky, right? Because from a clinical perspective, these illnesses can be quite debilitating, and we really can't fix that. So then the question kind of becomes, and for me, like the trauma guide was born out of one major thought, which is that trauma is not technically a pathology, it is an adaptation. So if you look at all of like most illnesses, right? So if we look at like an autoimmune disorder, we have T cells that attack our joints. This is rheumatoid arthritis. T cells are not supposed to attack our joints. This is a malfunction of the human body. But if you really look at trauma, trauma is an adaptation for survival that then becomes maladaptive. And we see so many questions in our community. How do I do this? How do I do this? How do I do this? I get overwhelmed when I go see my friends. My social anxiety is really bad. I don't have any motivation. I have no idea why I should get up in the morning. We see all of these questions. And then at some point, what I kind of realized is that like the problems that y'all face today are solutions from yesterday. So the reason that you stopped caring about life is because caring hurt. Caring didn't get you anywhere. You got punished for caring. And so then the question is, how can we teach y'all about yourselves and how you get formed? And that's what the trauma guide is. What are the most common things? So if you kind of go on the physiology of trauma, so I think this is where, like, you know, we look at things like physiologic rewiring. So your nervous system literally wires to be hyper aroused, which means that in benign situations like you going out with your friends, you can feel a high level of anxiety, even though you shouldn't. And then we can tell you shouldn't feel that way. And people will ask, like, how do I stop feeling anxious when I'm with my friends? I feel so stupid. This is a physiologic wiring problem. So how do you rewire your physiology? So we started off in sort of recognizing that a lot of the challenges that our community faces are from adaptations that they've made in the past. And then the question is, how can you readapt or unadapt? How can you change that adaptation and be in a healthy direction? So then what we did with the trauma guide was look at, okay, what are all the levels of adaptation? So there's physiology, there's emotions, there's cognitions, there's identity, there's relationships, there's behaviors. And then there's like the spiritual stuff. And so, like, once we understand all of these different dimensions of adaptation, we need to explain each of them in turn. And then once we explain each one, we need to give you actionable information, ideally, for each one of these things. And so, like, then really the goal is to go from start to finish of, like, understanding how your body, your brain, and your mind have adapted and how to readapt. And that's really what the goal of the trauma guide is. And then each of those steps also has research. So when I say, like, okay, physiologic rewiring and somatic illness, you know, so there's a bunch of papers that we have to go through, like, in order to make sure that what we're saying is, like, scientifically valid.
Yeah, we try to include that also whenever relevant to the video. If there is research that's relevant, or, like, you know, sources that are good to read as additional reading, we've tried to include them in any of the relevant videos.
Yeah. So then out of potentially 100 videos, what happens is we take, like, let's say the 30 that are the most valid, and we cut 70. So as we go through a lot of research, we'll, like, cut 70% of the guide because the research isn't there, or it's not actionable or something like that. So I think, like, the other thing to keep in, like, most of the guide gets cut. And then it's really the best stuff that makes it to the end. But that's a long process. And then there's also scripting and stuff like that, where, like, you know, I'll write a full script, which is about the length of one nonfiction book. And then we work with like a director and like, you know, we'll work the scripts, and we try to really make it so that, you know, I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but today we covered some complex stuff and we had 2 hours to kind of muddle through it. What really makes the guide hard is that there is very, very high yield, dense, accessible information. And we'll sometimes film each video like 3 or 4 times. So what'll happen is, like, a team will be like, this is a really important concept, but it was confusing, so we need to redo it. And so what we really, we invest a ton of time. So to make a 20-minute video takes probably about, like, 20 hours of work. And that's just, it's not just my time. It's also, like, people are reviewing it, and then there's, like, script edits, and there's a lot of, like, passing it back and forth. So there's a lot that does go into it. And so that's why we're kind of, like, I mean, hopefully this will help y'all, and we tend to be pretty proud of it. Because sometimes we'll get, you know, feedback that, you know, the guides are really useful, and, like, we know y'all are busy. We know that you don't have all the time in the world. We know there's a lot of shit that y'all have to do. So we try to really make things high yield and accessible. And the less you ramble, like, the harder it is to build.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a lot of what the work we go in, and the trauma module really has been a big project that we have been working on, just because it's like we're testing out new things. You want to do this new UI. You want to make it a little bit more accessible to everyone. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Take care, buddy.
And yeah, thank you.
Okay. We're going to do a little bit of Q&A before we wrap for the day. We've got about 15 minutes. So that lecture was supposed to take less time. It ended up taking about 2 hours, was supposed to take 90 minutes. So what questions do y'all have? Oh my God. So many good ones. Okay, I'm going to stop scrolling. Okay. Oh, so good. Okay, what's the relationship between gender dysphoria and dissociation? Okay. So what's the relationship between gender dysphoria and dissociation depersonalization? Great question. So we have actually a really great video that I think is on YouTube. We did a lecture some time ago, but Twitch doesn't store VODs, on gender identity and neurodiversity. So we know that your sense of gender identity comes from some of these interoceptive parts of your being. Okay, so we know that like your gender identity like comes from places like the insula and the PCC and the default mode network. So it is very common for people. So we know your sense of identity is. So we know that your sense of gender relates to your internal experience of self. The other thing that we know is that trauma messes with your internal experience of self. So if you have a history of trauma, you are more likely to have borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, you have dissociation, you have depersonalization. All of these things are more common. So it is very common for, and we know this as well, that history of trauma is a risk factor for gender identity related issues, including gender identity dysphoria. So what we know is that when you get traumatized, your sense of self becomes, for lack of a better word, confused, right? It is not quite as well formed. And as your sense of self becomes not as well formed, gender identity dysphoria can enter into that space. So they're absolutely correlated, and I think studies have shown that. Now, I don't know the relative impact of neurodiversity, BPD, narcissism on dissociation, depersonalization on gender identity. And I think one important thing to keep in mind is just because trauma is a risk factor for gender identity, that is not saying. So some people will interpret that as gender identity is a source, is a manifestation of mental illness because it's related to trauma. I don't think you can make that statement fairly. So there are some people that will make that claim, but I think this is where there's a lot of like nuance in the research, and I don't think that that's a fair extrapolation. So that's how they're related. Okay. I know you mentioned things like DID in here. Can we also get a deep dive specifically dedicated to complex dissociative disorders like DID and OSDD? Possibly is the short answer. So we get these kinds of requests a lot. And remember that just because you're asking today, I mean, the video may show up a year from now. Who knows? So, even this video or this lecture was something that has been in the works in some way for like about 2 years. So we know we've wanted to cover this at some point. The key thing to keep in mind is, can we get a lecture? The question that I have for y'all is, what do we give up to do that lecture? I have no problem doing a lecture on dissociative identity disorder. I think it's like fascinating. There's a whole different angle on this that we could take about spirituality and the sense of self and even past lives. There's all kinds of cool stuff that we can do about multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder. The question that I have for y'all is, what would you rather I do? A lecture on the harmful impacts of alcohol and alcohol addiction, nicotine and smoking cessation, or dissociative identity disorder? So I'm not trying to shut anyone down for asking that. I'm simply sharing with y'all that I want to talk about it all. And the question is, where's the priority? So oftentimes, what really inspire, and it's not that we have to talk about things that are the most common. So we actually are very careful about that. So even if you look at, this video that I referenced earlier about neurodiversity and gender identity. So 1% of people are non-binary, and 1% of people, 1 to 3% of people are on the autism spectrum, let's say. And so if you look at that, that's like 1% of 1%. So this is like a tiny slice of people, but we loved making that video. Like, that's okay. So I think it kind of answer is it depends. Okay. If I go to therapy, don't get re-traumatized and heal, will my brain look like a non-traumatized brain? Or are there physiologic changes to my brain bind on pickup that are permanent? Basically, is neuroplasticity reparative or compensatory? What a great question. I think that effectively, it's not bind on pickup. So I think we see, so I don't know, right? So if we look at studies on people with BPD and we see BPD in remission, I have not seen a single study, doesn't mean that it's out there and now I'm curious about it, looking at fMRI of someone with BPD before and after remission. So like we know, for example, that there are changes in the connections between your frontal lobes and your amygdala in BPD. I don't know what happens to those changes if that's been borne out in a like fMRI study. I suspect, though, that your brain changes and there's a ton of neuroplasticity. And the reason for that is because the clinical manifestations of a certain wiring of the brain are no longer there, right? So we know that when you have decreased control of your negative emotional circuitry from your frontal lobes, this results in emotional dysregulation. When you are in remission, that emotional dysregulation is practically or clinically non-significant. Now the question becomes, there are two questions. The first is, if there is no longer clinically significant emotional dysregulation, has the brain changed? I think the answer is probably, undoubtedly yes, to some degree. Because we also know that some of the interventions that lead to those clinical changes have been shown to change our brain. So using mindfulness practices and grounding practices absolutely does enhance the connections between your frontal lobes and your emotional circuitry. So we know that, I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but we know that treatment of BPD results in a clinical improvement. We know that meditating alters your brain, but we don't necessarily know that treating BPD alters your brain. I don't know if that study has been done, but we have both of the pieces that have been done. The second question, which I think is very important, is, does it matter? Right? So let's say that your brain is still wired in an old way, but clinically there's no change, or there's no problem anymore. Does it matter that your brain is still wired in the old way? I don't know. So I think that's like almost like a philosophical question. And the short answer is we don't really have the full answer, but I am heavily leaning towards your brain is quite neuroplastic and probably a lot changes. Okay. Would Yoga Nidra be effective to build salience? Not really. So I don't know. Maybe, actually. That's a really interesting question. So it's an interesting question. My instinctive answer is no. So in Yoga Nidra, the key thing is a sankalpa. So Yoga Nidra has a couple of different mechanisms of action. The first is a rotating awareness of the body. So that'll definitely help you be grounded in your body. It'll increase neuroplasticity of the somatosensory cortex. So those are the things that we know will happen. Now, salience and sankalpa are slightly different things. So sankalpa is, at the end of the Yoga Nidra practice, you do something called a sankalpa, which is like build a resolve. So you kind of implant something in your unconscious or subconscious mind that then like floats up to the surface. So if you kind of think about, your impulsive desires, like today I feel like eating a hamburger. So you're kind of and you have a random encounter that says, I want a hamburger. So this is kind of what desires are like in the mind. You can think about them like a random encounter in an RPG, right? So it's like, depending on where you are, in this random encounter, you'll fight against like 3 imps and 1 boar. So the thing about yoga nidra is when we use a sankalpa, we're sort of editing the random encounter table. So that as you're you run into a random encounter and, oh, look, it's a treasure chest. So this is one of those rare random encounters that doesn't mess you up, but actually gives you something positive. So sankalpa is almost like implanting things in your unconscious that will then float to the surface. Now, whether that relates to salience in the brain, I'm not quite sure. Because salience in the brain oftentimes relates to the significance of external stimuli. So whether your brain decides this is important or not important. And then the last thing is that the sankalpa issue is a little bit tricky because we don't have any neuroscience evidence that this even exists, right? So that's when things get really tricky, is that the more advanced esoteric yogic stuff is like more divorced from science. And some of it is actually quite contrary to science, in some ways. So we don't really know. It's a fascinating question. I love the question, and I'll be on the lookout for it. Okay. How would mediation look for a person with dissociation? I'm assuming that means meditation. So I prepared a lecture. How does meditation look for people who are dissociating? Hold on a second. Let me see if I can pull this up. So I made this some time ago, and I wanted to do a video about it or a lecture about it. So a while ago, I saw an interesting post about meditation for PTSD. And so what I did is I went through, this is like a little bit more related to my clinical work, but what I did is look at the features of PTSD and complex PTSD, mapped out the organ system that is involved with this feature. So we know that people with PTSD have physical reactivity, have hypervigilance, have an increased startle reaction, have emotional distress, negative affect, difficulty experiencing positive affect, irritability or aggression, trauma-related thoughts and feelings, difficulty in concentrating, riskier destructive behavior, consciousness alterations, distorted perceptions, self-perception changes. And then what I did is I looked at like, okay, what's going on in the brain or the body? And then I tried to figure out if we have any scientific evidence that meditation will affect this thing. And then which practices activate this thing, if that kind of makes sense. So, for example, when we have physiologic reactivity, there are some meditations that activate the vagus nerve and calm us down by activating and engaging the parasympathetic nervous system. And then what are the practices that do that? So I kind of built this table to try to talk a little bit about how meditation can be geared towards trauma. So this is work that I was doing many years ago at Harvard Medical School, where this was like my day job, is like my job was developing evidence-based approaches, utilizing meditation in a targeted fashion, particular meditative practices, to target specific aspects of mental illness. So the short answer is, does it get modified? I would say yes. I'm still working on this. I don't know if this is ever going to see the light of day beyond this, but Trinian was asking, like, can you tell us a little bit about what goes into a guide? So, I mean, I do a lot of this stuff that doesn't see the light of day, and then we'll eventually make it into a guide at some point or something like that. So the short answer is that I think that there are adaptations that are necessary. The biggest adaptation that is, so there's like complex adaptations like what we just showed y'all. And then there are, I'm not recommending that you guys use that chart because the chart hasn't been vetted. We haven't done clinical trials and things like that, right? This is just, I'm working on it. The most important thing to keep in mind when it comes to meditation and trauma is that in trauma, our brain is suppressing certain things. And in meditation, what we're generally doing is opening up the mind. right? So like in mindfulness, for example, they'll say, observe your thoughts without engagement or attachment. Just notice your thoughts and let whatever thought comes come. The problem is that if you have a history of trauma, some of those thoughts you can't just observe. Some of those thoughts are physiologically overwhelming, psychologically overwhelming, will destroy you, which is why your brain keeps them locked away at the basement. It's kind of like thinking about nuclear waste that's been buried, right? So if you're like a mindfulness meditator and you're like, enjoy your surroundings, and then your surroundings is radioactive waste, you're going to die. Like you will get radiation poisoning and you're screwed. So if you look at the evidence-based interventions for trauma, they're very specific meditation techniques, and they're usually from the grounding dimension of meditation. So EMDR is not open awareness of thoughts. DBT does not have open awareness of thoughts. They actually use powerful sensory techniques to pull you into the present and out of your mind. Even self-injurious behavior, like cutting, is almost like a meditation technique. It leads to emotional relief by focusing the attention of the mind outside of thoughts. So when patients engage in cutting, I'm not recommending that you'll do cutting. You can meditate without hurting yourself. But cutting has some really interesting associations. The first is that maximum pain for minimum damage, right? You'll get that. So it's surface level cuts. And even if you look at the nerves in your arm, for example, so people will cut on the arm or the leg, the thigh. So you have different kinds of nerves, and your pain receptors are really close to the surface. And then there are other deeper pain receptors that don't get activated. So when people cut, they actually do maximum pain with minimum damage. And then the question becomes why? And if you ask people who cut, they say that this helps me, it relieves mental tension. It's still not healthy to do. It's very effective, but it's not healthy. And that's why we teach people how to meditate instead. So we want to use grounding techniques, not open awareness techniques in meditation related to trauma, or we want to use meditation with a trained clinician who can help you manage those emotions that come up. Jesus, there's so many questions. What is the difference between dissociation from ego and dissolution of ego from traumatic versus spiritual? So I think we addressed that some in the guide. We've talked about that a lot. Even we had a memberships lecture, deep dive into ego. That's a whole lecture, which we can do if y'all want at some point. I don't mean to bounce the question. Can dissociation manifest as getting tired/yawning when overwhelmed? I suppose so. It's not something that I've seen. Most of the research on yawning that I've looked at has to do with sociopathy. Can depersonalization result from growing up with ADHD? Absolutely. So, I'm beginning to think that there's a solid chance that if you grow up with ADHD, the process of growing up with ADHD is traumatic. Not always, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that ADHD is a causative factor for depression. And I don't think that these are like independent neurobiological mechanisms. This is like when you grow up with ADHD, you have a very poor self-esteem. You have a very poor social relationship situation. You don't get invited to birthday parties. You don't wait your turn in line. You get ostracized. So unless you become the class clown, no one really likes you. And so that will lead to things like depression. And the mechanism of that is almost certainly traumatic. Interesting question about yawning. How does dissociation affect romantic relationships? Okay. Which question was I answering? Okay, I got time for one. Okay, how does dissociation affect romantic relationships? So the answer is absolutely. So there's a whole, so in the trauma guide, we dive a lot. There's 2 lectures on relationships. So let's understand this very simply, okay? So if you have a history of trauma, engaging in relationships is very difficult. And if we look at clinical diagnoses related to trauma, what we tend to find is that relationship difficulties are part of the clinical picture of trauma. So in borderline personality disorder, which is related to trauma, we have a history of unstable and intense relationships. That's one of the diagnostic criteria. If we look at things like narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder has a feature that is difficulty in relationships. We also see difficulty in relationships as features of complex PTSD. So in complex PTSD, we have impairments in things related to the self, and that includes relationships. So let's understand why. A relationship is about a connection between you and me. If there is a problem with me, there will be a problem with the relationship. If there is a problem with identity, there are definitely going to be problems with relationships. Because then the me itself is not stable, is problematic in some way. So if if relationship is A plus B and A is somewhat messed up, then A plus B is going to be somewhat messed up. We also have evidence that shows that trauma correlates with changes in attachment style. So the more traumatized you are, so in the cases of severe trauma, we'll see a disorganized attachment style, and that is all about how you connect to other people. You connect to other people in a disorganized way. So we'll see things like an anxious attachment style, where if your needs were not met, sometimes we become anxiously attached and we become clingy, which will affect our relationships. Sometimes we have an avoidant attachment style, where our emotional vulnerabilities punished us. So we work very hard to be emotionally unavailable. That will absolutely affect your relationships. So in the trauma guide, we even talk about sex and attachment style, where people will utilize sexual relationships to serve their attachment style. So people who are anxiously attached will utilize sex to create emotional intimacy. People who are securely attached will use sex to express emotional intimacy. So the emotional intimacy is already there. The sex is the fruit on the tree of emotional intimacy. For people with an anxious attachment style, sex is used to create emotional intimacy. It is fertilizer so that the tree grows. I'm going to utilize sex to make you feel connected to me. Because if I don't feel connected to you, I'm going to use sex to keep you here and make you love me. That's what happens in anxious attachment style. And then my favorite, the avoidant attachment style, which is sex is utilized as the axe to chop down the tree of emotional intimacy in avoidant attachment style. Sex is utilized to prevent an emotional connection. So since I feel connected to you, and in the past, emotional vulnerability is something that has hurt me and I'm scared of, I'm going to use a mechanical, biological action to separate us. This is just about sex. Don't catch feelings. Let's be friends with benefits. Let's turn this into a situationship. Let's not make it a real relationship, because real relationships are complicated, hard, and sometimes emotionally hurt me. And by the way, I don't really know how to participate well in them. I don't know how to articulate my emotional needs. I don't know how to feel vulnerable. I feel scared. It's terrifying. So instead, it's smash and go. So there is a lot of relationship between attachment style relationships and trauma. And some of it has to do with our sense of identity. And when our sense of identity is not well formed, we can't really relate to people very well, or it leads to a lot of mixed signals or confusion in relationships, because today I'm one way and tomorrow I'm a different way. And then it can even form it can affect the way that we form bonds with people. And even something as simple as the sexual act can have drastically different implications for two different people, right? And we see that a lot in these situationships, where one person has an anxious attachment style, the other person has an avoidant attachment style. So what happens in this scenario? I feel you being emotionally distant to me, so let's have sex so that I can pull you in. And then when we have sex, I'm using it to pull you in, you're using sex to push me away. And then we get really problematic where this person is distant. And then it leads to a lot of resentment. They just used me. And so like all kinds of problems that we see with these situationships that are happening on the internet, a lot of this has to do with this kind of crap. So it's huge. So dissociation affects romantic relationships very intensely. Is there anything about PNES in the trauma guide? Not directly. So PNES is psychogenic non-epileptiform seizures. We do talk about somatic illness. So I don't know if we cover pseudo-seizures specifically, but a lot of the stuff that applies to there's a whole lecture on somatic illness. A lot of the stuff in the lecture on somatic illness will apply to psychogenic seizures. Ham Solo, dissociation and trading. Can you explain what you mean by that? And at me, bro. So I see it. Okay, so what are the common things that lead to dissociation? Like gaming is one, right? Okay, so this is very important to understand. Gaming does not lead to dissociation. Gaming is an artificial form of dissociation. So what leads to dissociation is usually overwhelming emotion. So I'm unconnected, I'm feeling, feelings are getting worse. And when they rise beyond a certain threshold, it's too much to handle. Boom, unplug the circuit. We're going to dissociate. So dissociation is almost always, well, actually, that's not fair to say. Forget about that. I don't know about almost always. But traditionally, the way we conceptualize dissociation is an overwhelming emotional experience triggers dissociation. Gaming accomplishes the same thing. So gaming will induce a similar state of emotional numbness. And since we're using gaming is like lidocaine or anesthesia for our emotions. And since we're using this external thing, we no longer need to trigger the internal dissociation. Great question. Is it true that BPD is just a more extreme form of disorganized attachment? I don't think so. I wouldn't describe it that way. So the features of disorganized attachment are quite severe, and I don't think it is one-to-one with BPD. I think there are different ways, there are different facets of looking at a person. How do I find balance between feel your emotions and rewire your brain? I get either stuck intellectualizing everything or get lost in the borderline depression burnout /burnout. Yeah, so rewire your brain or feel your emotions. Which one? So I think this is the challenge, right? How do you find the balance between, I should feel my emotions and I should fix my problems? It's a really common issue. Okay, this is the last question we're going to cover today. So a lot of times we'll say bruh, you should feel your emotions. But it's let's say I go through a breakup, or let's say my relationship is challenging. How much of this is I need to learn to sit with my emotions of sadness and shame versus I need to fix this relationship or find a different partner? How do you know when you're supposed to solve your problems or sit with them? Great question. Because we say do both. And if you're telling me to sit with my problems, should I solve, doesn't that mean that I'm not solving them? So at the very beginning, this seems like an either or. But the better that you get at it, the more you will discover that it actually becomes two birds with one stone. So if you really pay attention to what keeps you from solving your problems, it is an inability to sit with your emotions. The two are actually one and the same. Now let's understand why. Let's say that I have a relationship that is not going well. What keeps me from fixing the relationship? It is the fear of the consequence of trying to fix the relationship. If I set a boundary with my partner, if I set a boundary with my boss, I'm afraid they will break up with me. I'm afraid they won't like me. I'm afraid they won't promote me. So in order to avoid our negative emotions, we start shaping our behavior. Since we can't sit with our emotions, the only choice is to avoid them ever happening. So then what happens is our life becomes controlled by avoidance. Anything that leads to conflict or fear or shame, I cannot do. I am embarrassed about my body. I feel ashamed when I go to the gym, so I'm going to sit at home. Fucked. Right? Interesting. I'm tired of being walked over by my spouse, but I'm afraid that they're going to get angry if I try to set a boundary with them. So I'm not going to bring it up with them, and I'm going to continue to harbor resentment, and I'm not even going to give them feedback that this is not okay. So this is what's really interesting. Fixing your problems is over there. Accepting your emotions is over here. But when we do this, this is the first step to go in this direction. Okay, if you really pay attention to it, accepting your circumstances is the first step to change. It doesn't mean an absence of change, and this is what really confuses people. Acceptance starts here, but it doesn't mean a particular goal, right? So we see this very practically when we look at like Alcoholics Anonymous. These are people who've been sober for 30 years, and they say, hi, my name is Alok, I'm an alcoholic. You haven't had a drink in 30 years. How are you an alcoholic? Yeah, that's how it works. So they start with acceptance. Acceptance is the first form of change. It's the first step of change because you have to accept where you are in order to go somewhere else. Now let's look at the opposite of acceptance. What do we call that? Denial. And how easy is it to fix a problem when you are in denial? Hey, Alok, you have a drinking problem. No, I don't. Hey, it's very hurtful to me when you say these kinds of things. No, it isn't. That is your insecurity that you need to fix. I'm not doing anything wrong. Right? So sitting with your emotions and fixing your problems comes hand in hand. So sit with your emotions, accept the way that they are in this moment, and once you've accepted them, how can we go about changing it? How can we go about fixing it? All right, so this is very important to understand, very confusing. And it's not your fault. Very practically, how do you get good at this? Because this person was talking about, I over-intellectualize sometimes, and then I sometimes feel too many emotions. I don't know which one to do. So if you think about, how do you learn balance in anything? My food is oversalted, my food is undersalted. How do I find the right amount of salt? Keep cooking. So the good news is that you don't have to figure it out. Your brain will figure it out if you give it enough experience. So the other biggest problem that we tend to have when we're trying to figure out, I hyper-intellectualize and sometimes I feel overly emotional. How do I balance these two things? See, you can't balance them here intellectually, theoretically. The right way to find balance is through experience. Literally, how does a child learn how to balance? Do they sit there and think about it? No, they fall like 100 times. So you have circuits in your brain that are focused on balancing. All they need is more data. And if you look at people who are paralyzed between over-intellectualization and over-emotion, what you usually see, not always, it's more complicated than this, is a lack of experience. So when I look at people who are like over-intellectualized in dating or overly emotional in dating, what you tend to see is a lower amount of dating experience. So the good news is that your brain has all these neuroplastic circuits, which will help you find balance. Just keep collecting data, keep collecting data, keep collecting data, which is one of the reasons why people will say, put yourself out there. The reason putting yourself out there works, there's many potential reasons, many reasons it doesn't work. But one of the reasons that works really well is that the more you give your brain data, the more it will adapt to the circumstance. There's some problems with that as well. But so how do you find the balance? With practice. Just like balancing if you're a gymnast, just like balancing if you're a kid, just like balancing if you're a chef. Okay? So that's all the time we have for today. I know we ran a little bit long, but that's great. That's why we do this. We sort of budget to run a little bit long. Thank y'all all for coming today. We've got, we're streaming, I think, 4 days next week. We've got some awesome interviews lined up. So we're interviewing, I think we're going to be talking to Ms. Kiff on Monday, Sapnap on Wednesday. We have a members Q&A on Thursday, and then Ali Abdal on Friday. So definitely check that stuff out if y'all are interested. So mostly interviews next week. And our trauma guide is live. So it was built with a lot of love. Definitely check it out. And keep it coming, chat. So if you guys have other questions, follow-ups, things like that, I know that sometimes when y'all ask questions, it feels like it's going into the void. And to a sense, it is, because we get like hundreds of questions every stream, and there's just no way we can get to them all. At the same time, we do pay attention to most of them, and we slot a lot of them away, and every once in a while. So just to give you all an example, we had a membership stream yesterday about building a meditative practice, and we had 150 questions. The good news is that the top 15 we addressed in like a 1 hour lecture. So the good news is that we file away a lot of these questions. We'll take the highest yield, most important questions, and we'll try to stitch something together that will answer many, 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 many questions. And I think part of the reason that we see a lot of growth in our community is because when we put together a lecture, this lecture that we did today is actually built off of like a dozen to 20 questions that have been asked. And so we try to really put together questions and deliver information in as efficient of a manner as possible. The guide is really good at that. That's why it takes so long to build, right? So if you look at like the guide, maybe 10 to 12 hours of lectures. Today we did 3 hours, but the guide takes like 50 times more work. And that's because we really want to stitch things together to be incredibly efficient and applicable, as opposed to Dr. K ranting for 3 hours. So thank you all very much for coming today. Have a good weekend. Strong work, everybody.